Hey there, welcome to True Crime Records. Tonight, we're stepping into the quiet power behind one of the most famous crime stories ever told, a man whose face was rarely seen, whose name was barely spoken, yet whose influence shaped an entire underworld. Paul Vario. That he wasn't flashy, he wasn't loud, he didn't chase headlines. While others chased headlines, Paul Vario moved the strings that the public. The spotlight belonged to street soldiers, wild personalities, and violent outbursts. But behind those men stood someone colder, quieter, and far more dangerous. The man who gave the orders and never had to shout if Goodfellas showed you the chaos of the mob. Paul Vario represents the calm control behind it, a neighborhood figure, a trusted capo, a man who ruled without ever appearing to rule. Tonight, we follow the unseen godfather of a criminal empire. From the streets of Brooklyn to the backrooms where loyalty was tested, fortunes were controlled, and silence meant survival. Before we begin, drop a comment and tell me where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. Our late-night true crime family stretches across the world. Now settle in. Let the noise of the day fade and follow me into the quiet authority of a man who ruled without ever needing the spotlight. This is True Crime Records, and if you're new here, make sure to subscribe. There's a new story waiting for you every night. Chapter 1. The Making of a Silent Power. Long before the cameras, before the headlines, before the world ever heard the words Goodfellas, the streets of Brooklyn were already shaping a man who would one day control everything without ever needing to be seen. Paul Vario was born into a world where power didn't wear suits and didn't need approval. It lived in back rooms, neighborhood bars, and quiet handshakes that meant more than any signed contract. The Brooklyn he grew up in was crowded, noisy, and restless. A place where survival depended on who you knew, what you could move, and how well you kept your mouth shut. From a young age, Paul learned one of the most important rules of the street. The loud ones disappear first. While others chased attention, Paul learned patience. While others showed off, he watched. He studied the older men, not the ones who bragged, but the ones everyone deferred to without question. The men who never raised their voice yet somehow controlled the room the moment they walked in. He understood early on that real power didn't announce itself. It waited. His teenage years, Paul was already connected to small-time hustles. Nothing flashy, nothing reckless. He didn't choose the violent path right away. He chose the useful one. He learned how money moved through the neighborhood, how protection worked, how favors traveled faster than threats. While other young men tried to prove how dangerous they were, Paul proved how necessary he could become. That distinction changed everything. In the post-war years, New York's underworld was transforming. Old ethnic gangs were giving way to structured crime families. The streets were no longer ruled by chaos. They were being organized. Territories were being defined. Profits were being systemized, and Paul Vario fit perfectly into that evolution. He didn't want to be known as the toughest man on the block. He wanted to be the man everyone had to go through to. Small scores turned into bigger operations. Paul built a reputation not for violence, but for reliability. If he said something would be done, it happened. If he promised protection, it stuck. If he gave his word, it held weight. That made him more valuable than any reckless enforcer. Soon, the right people began to notice by the time he entered the world of organized crime fully. He wasn't stepping in as a street punk. He was stepping in as a man with connections, discipline, and most importantly, silence. Silence was his currency. While others talked themselves into graves or prison cells, Paul mastered the art of saying nothing at all. He let other men take the risks. He let other men attract attention. From a distance, he studied outcomes. And when opportunity presented itself, Paul moved with precision, slow, measured, and permanent. This was how he began rising within the structure that would eventually make him one of the most powerful captains in New York. Not through chaos, but through control. By the time most people in Brooklyn knew his name, Paul Vario was already several steps ahead of the game. He had earned the trust of powerful figures. He had proven his value without ever overplaying his hand. The street did not fear him yet. The street relied on him. And that, in the long run, is far more dangerous, because fear can fade. But reliance creates dependency, and dependency creates empires. As the years moved forward, Paul Vario quietly positioned himself at the crossroads of money, loyalty, and protection, the three pillars of organized crime. The world around him grew louder, faster, more violent. He grew quieter. And in that quiet, his shadow only grew larger. By the early 1950s, New York had become a city of invisible borders. The streets looked ordinary to outsiders. Corner stores, quiet row houses, neon signs glowing at night. But underneath, every block belonged to someone. Power wasn't marked with flags or uniforms. It was understood through silence, through who collected what, and who no one dared to cross. Paul Vario learned to move through this landscape like a man reading an invisible map. He kept his world small on the surface. A social club, a handful of trusted faces, a routine that never changed. To neighbors, he looked predictable. But predictability was exactly what protected him. It made him invisible. While violent men burned fast and loud, Paul built slow. He specialized in loyalty long before he specialized in money. That if someone needed protection, Paul handled it. If a debt needed collecting, Paul arranged it. That if someone needed a door opened, Paul knew who held the key, and he never rushed anything. Men began relying on him because he was steady. When others panicked, Paul waited. When others overreacted, Paul listened. This made him useful to people higher up the ladder. Men who didn't need another wild soldier, but needed someone who could keep a crew stable. Stability is power in the underworld. As his influence grew, Paul found himself moving closer to the inner structure of the Lucchese crime family, one of the most powerful organized crime groups in the country. But he did not rise quickly or publicly. He rose quietly, one favor at a time. That he was never the man in the newspaper. He was never the man arrested first. He was never the man giving interviews. He was the man people quietly checked with before they acted. That made him dangerous. Paul understood that leadership in his world wasn't about intimidation. It was about dependency. If enough people depended on you for money, safety, and direction, you didn't need to threaten them. They protected you because their own success was tied to your survival. This became his strategy. That he encouraged younger men to work for him. He didn't flatter them with false glory. He gave them structure, a job, a hierarchy, a purpose, and most importantly, protection. Men who worked under Paul didn't feel abandoned. They felt covered. That loyalty went deep. While others built crews through fear, Paul built his through security. If a problem arose, he handled it quietly. If someone crossed a line, the response was controlled, not chaotic. The message traveled faster than the action ever could. Paul took care of his OWN. By the time federal authorities began mapping organized crime families seriously, Paul already had insulation. People below him took risks. People above him dealt with strategy. Paul sat in the middle, the safest place to sit. That he made sure he was invaluable but rarely visible. His reputation slowly changed. At first, he was known as dependable, then as connected. Eventually, he became known as someone whose approval mattered. Street-level criminals started seeking him out not for violence, but for permission. That's when a man truly becomes powerful, because when people ask permission before acting, the structure has already formed. Paul Vario had become a gatekeeper. What made this rise even more dangerous was that it appeared natural. There were no dramatic takeovers, no sudden grabs for territory, just quiet expansion, agreements that weren't written down, boundaries that were understood but never announced. And over time, Paul's name became attached to opportunity. If someone wanted to earn seriously, they went through Paul. That if someone needed protection from rivals, they went through Paul. That if someone needed access to higher authority, they went through Paul. That he was no longer just participating in organized crime, that he was organizing it. Through the 1960s, his influence spread deeper into the business side of crime: labor rackets, trucking, construction, unions, theft rings. The violent side still existed, but it was always a step removed from him. Paul positioned himself where strategy lived, not where blood spilled. He let others get their hands dirty. That distance protected him from exposure and from guilt. Men above him trusted him because he delivered results. Men below him trusted him because he delivered security. And the neighborhood trusted him because nothing exploded around his presence. Quiet stability became his signature. By the end of the decade, Paul Vario was no longer just a neighborhood figure. He was a controlling force within a powerful criminal family, not through fear, but through dependence. And somewhere during that time, he began to build a second layer beneath his crew. A layer of younger men, hungrier men, riskier men, men who would later become famous. But at this stage, they were just tools. And Paul, carefully, patiently, was selecting exactly which tools he would use. By the late 1960s, the structure around Paul Vario had become solid enough to expand outward without collapsing inward. That was the moment he began selecting men not just for loyalty, but for potential. This wasn't about brute force alone. It was about chemistry, about finding personalities that could generate money, intimidation, and street movement, while still bending to authority. That's where his most dangerous creation began that he didn't recruit loudly. He observed. Some men caught his attention through discipline, others through ambition, some through recklessness, and a few through a rare combination of all three. Paul understood that volatility could be useful if it was kept on a leash. And he was very good at building leashes. The new crew that formed beneath him wasn't ordinary. These were men who moved fast, talked sharp, took risks, and thrived in pressure. They were hungry for status, impatient for wealth, and eager to prove themselves. Exactly the kind of men who could generate enormous profit and enormous chaos. If left unchecked, Paul made sure they were checked. He didn't micromanage them. He didn't smother their momentum. Instead, he built invisible barriers around their freedom. They could climb, but only along paths he approved. They could earn, but only through systems he controlled. They could gain reputation, but only so long as it reinforced his authority. That on the surface, the crew looked independent. That in reality, every road led back to Paul. What made this crew different was its efficiency. They were involved in theft rings, hijackings, gambling operations, union jobs, and underground networks that moved cash quietly and quickly. Money flowed upward in measured streams, never all at once, never recklessly. That alone kept federal interest at a distance. Paul didn't want attention, that he wanted infrastructure when trouble arose, and it always does at that level. He didn't respond with rage. He responded with insulation. If someone got reckless, the discipline came swiftly but quietly. If someone crossed a line, the consequences didn't spill into the open. Everything stayed contained. That containment was his greatest skill. Many men confuse power with visibility. Paul understood that visibility was weakness. As the crew grew in reputation, whispers began moving through the city. About a group that made money quickly. About a captain who kept his people protected. About a structure that rarely lost. But those whispers rarely included his name. And that was intentional. That he let the younger men absorb the reputation. That he absorbed the control. Behind every major score, behind every successful operation, behind every protected territory, there he was, seated calmly, assembling pieces without appearing on the board. The men beneath him gained fame. He gained stability, and stability compounds. The real turning point came when some of those younger men began operating as if they were independent. Flashy spending, loud celebrations, public bravado. That kind of exposure would have ended most captains. But Paul had prepared for it. He didn't crush them, that he redirected them, that he used their reputation as distraction while tightening his financial hold behind the scenes. If law enforcement watched the loud ones, they missed the quiet one. If headlines followed the chaos, the control remained invisible. And it worked. As the early 1970s approached, the crew beneath him had become one of the most profitable engines in his world. And yet, very few outside organized crime understood who truly controlled it. That illusion of independence was his masterstroke. That to the public, the crew looked wild. That to law enforcement, they looked fragmented. To rivals, they looked dangerous but disorganized. Only the men inside knew the truth. There was one voice that mattered. Point one approval that decided advancement. Point one man whose silence carried more weight than any threat. Paul had finished building his foundation. The city didn't see a Godfather. The city saw a movement. But beneath that movement stood a single organizing mind, calm, invisible, and calculating, guiding everything without needing to stand at the front. And that was only the beginning, because soon, this hidden structure would crash into history itself. Chapter 2. Power Without a Crown. By the early 1970s, Paul Vario had become something far more dangerous than a public boss. He had become a silent center of gravity. He didn't need a throne. He didn't need ceremonies or public recognition. His power lived in the way decisions quietly bent in his favor before anyone realized a decision had even been made. In the world he operated in, titles were useful, but invisible influence was unstoppable. While other crime figures chased publicity, respect, or fear, Paul chased positioning. He placed himself where money flowed upward and problems flowed downward. That meant he rarely stood at the scene of chaos. He waited behind it, already prepared for the consequences before they arrived. Why now? His crew was no longer just a group of earners. They were an engine, a constantly turning machine of theft, hijacking, loan sharking, labor rackets, and controlled unions. The profits were steady, the attention stayed elsewhere, and the structure held. What made Paul exceptional wasn't brutality that IT was forecasting. He saw trouble before it reached him. If law enforcement leaned in one direction, he quietly shifted operations another way. If a rival began pushing boundaries, Paul didn't rush to confront him. He waited for pressure to make the rival unstable on his own. He understood that interference draws attention. Patience dissolves enemies. That he ruled by waiting better than everyone else. That those beneath him. Paul felt permanent, like part of the natural order. His presence wasn't exciting, it was stabilizing. Young men who worked under him didn't feel like soldiers. They felt like employees in something that would always exist. That illusion of permanence created deeper loyalty than fear ever could. But permanence in his world was always an illusion. As the decades turned, New York itself began to change. The streets grew louder. The media moved faster. Federal law enforcement expanded its reach. Technology began shrinking the distance between crime and consequence. The era of invisible empires was coming to its end, slowly, but inevitably. Paul sensed it long before others did. He began distancing himself from operational decisions. Not completely, just enough to create buffers. More middlemen, more layers, more insulation. Each move pushed him closer to strategic silence and further from tactical risk. This was the paradox of his power. The more he controlled, the less he was seen. And the less he was seen, the harder it became to trace. By the time some of the younger men beneath him began attracting national attention, Paul had already placed several degrees of separation between himself and their actions. He had built a firewall around his identity, not through secrecy alone, but through normalcy. He lived like a neighborhood man, that he moved like a businessman, he spoke like someone who had nothing to hide. And that was the most effective disguise of all. Neighbors. He was unremarkable. Rivals. He was difficult to locate. Law enforcement. He was frustratingly intangible. Paul had mastered the art of existing in the gap between known and provable. But that gap doesn't remain open forever, because when power becomes too quiet, it eventually attracts the kind of attention that listens instead of looks. And somewhere in the distance, that kind of attention was beginning to approach. For most of his life, Paul Vario had lived in a protective quiet. Not silence exactly. There was always movement, money, meetings, conflict, but it existed beneath the surface, low enough to slip under the awareness of ordinary life. The outside world didn't ignore him. It simply failed to see him clearly. That had always been his advantage. But by the mid-1970s, the world itself was changing. Law enforcement was no longer reacting only to street violence. They began following patterns. Money, labor, infrastructure. Organized crime was no longer viewed as a collection of scattered gangs. It was now seen as a corporate structure. And corporate structures leave paper trails. Paul felt the air shifting long before any agents ever knocked on his door. The signals were subtle at first. A familiar face stopped visiting the social club. A union contract suddenly faced scrutiny. A hijacking that normally would have disappeared into silence turned into a case with press coverage. These were not coincidences. These were pressure points. For the first time in decades, Paul's world was being studied rather than observed. He adjusted immediately, quietly, carefully. He changed meeting routines, reduced the number of people who could reach him directly, shifted money flows through longer channels. Layers were added where none had been needed before. The operation became slower, but safer. At least, that was the hope. But insulation has a limit, and no matter how skilled a man is at hiding behind others, eventually someone at the edge of the structure begins to crack. Not from fear, often from frustration. Younger men grow impatient. Middlemen grow greedy. Associates start making mistakes, and mistakes are loud. As federal pressure intensified across the city, informants began appearing where none had existed before. Quiet men who had once sworn loyalty now found themselves faced with choices no code truly prepares you for. Prison, families, survival. Those calculations do not favor tradition. Paul understood this too. He never spoke about betrayal directly. He never threatened it away. Instead, he relied on psychology. Distance. The silent implication that loyalty was still safer than cooperation. For some, that was enough. For others, it wasn't. And once one person begins speaking, the structure stops being secure. It becomes transparent. Still, Paul did not panic. Panic betrays identity. Calm maintains it. While the outside world searched for proof, Paul focused on continuity, ensuring income streams still flowed, ensuring his reputation remained untouched by hysteria, ensuring his personal life remained small and unprovocative. The less extraordinary he appeared, the harder it would be to convince a jury he was extraordinary at all. The IT was a brilliant strategy, but there was a flaw in it. The flaw was the people beneath him. As some of the younger men in his orbit attracted increasing attention through reckless behavior, public exposure, and violent reputation. The spotlight that Paul had spent decades avoiding began drifting closer whether he wanted it or not. He had built silence. They brought noise. That imbalance created tension Paul could not fully eliminate without destroying his own profitability. The very men who enriched his operation were now exposing it. And if he crushed them publicly, it would confirm every suspicion authorities had. If he protected them blindly, their exposure would eventually circle back to him anyway. For the first time, Paul faced a kind of threat he could not redirect: visibility. The late 1970s were no longer an era of quiet crime. They were an era of televised trials, exposed rackets, and reputations dismantled in headlines. The machinery of justice did not move quickly, but it moved steadily. And steady is always more dangerous than fast. Paul began to feel the walls narrowing, not through fear, but through limitations. Every decision now carried potential echo. Every alliance required greater caution. Every meeting had to be placed between layers of deniability. The work of invisibility had become heavier. Maintaining silence now required effort instead of habit. Yet still, from the outside, nothing appeared to change. Neighbors saw a consistent figure. The streets saw controlled movement. The city saw only surface disorder. But internally, Paul was now managing defensive power rather than expanding power. There is a world of difference between the two. Expansion is optimistic. Defense is fatalistic. And even the best tactician cannot defend forever against a system designed to outlast individuals. Paul had spent a lifetime mastering the art of remaining unseen. But now the very concept of organized crime was becoming something the public could see clearly for the first time. And once a system becomes visible, it cannot return to shadow, not fully. The question was no longer if Paul's name would surface. It was when and through whom. By the time the outside pressure became impossible to ignore, the illusion that Paul had built over decades was no longer cracking at the edges. It was beginning to creak at the center. For years, his greatest advantage had been distance. Distance from violence. Distance from transactions. Distance from risk. But distance only works when the structure beneath it remains stable. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, that structure was losing its balance. The city was no longer the same city he had mastered. Federal investigations had become broader, more patient, less dramatic, and far more dangerous. Instead of chasing individual crimes, they were tracing patterns: movement of cash, overlap of personnel, shared territories, repeated names in unrelated investigations. The map of organized crime was no longer being drawn in chalk. It was being etched in permanent ink. Paul sensed that shift before most people did, and he made the only move left to someone in his position. He pulled inward. Meetings became shorter. Access became tighter. Decisions became slower and more calculated. The world that once felt open and navigable now felt like a narrowing corridor. He still controlled money. He still influenced outcomes. But now every action felt heavier, as if the air itself resisted movement. And then came the mistakes. Not his, but theirs. Men beneath him began drawing attention through excess. Loud spending, public disputes, wild behavior that spilled into the wrong neighborhoods and crossed into the wrong jurisdictions. The careful invisibility Paul had crafted was being dulled by other people's need to be seen. That was the tension at the heart of his empire. The men who generated profit were no longer content with quiet success. They wanted recognition, and recognition is poison in that world. Paul attempted to correct this not through fear, but through containment. He restricted operations, shifted earners into different channels, reduced visible activity. The machine still functioned, but it ran more quietly, more cautiously, slower, but controlled. The problem was, once people taste visibility, they struggle to return to invisibility. Some didn't listen, some didn't care, and some were too reckless to understand the stakes at all. That recklessness became unavoidable for law enforcement. It created entry points, leads that led to other leads, threads that, once pulled, revealed larger designs. Paul had built insulation assuming discipline would always protect it. Discipline was now eroding at the same time. The world itself was becoming less forgiving of silence. Media coverage expanded. Organized crime was no longer treated as rumor or folklore. It was treated as a national problem. Politicians ran on promises to dismantle it. Prosecutors built careers on proving they could dismantle it. The environment had turned hostile, not violently, but systematically. And systems always defeat individuals in the long run. Paul's response was not to fight harder, but to fade further. He withdrew from presence. Let others appear to lead. Let others draw suspicion. Let others absorb the heat. To outsiders, it began to look like his influence was declining. In reality, he was repositioning himself into deeper shadow. But shadow has limits when the structure around it collapses. More cases began stacking across the city. More names entered databases. Associates who once felt untouchable began disappearing into courtrooms and prison systems. Loyalty was no longer just a moral question. It became a strategic calculation. And strategy does not always favor tradition. Paul did not panic, but he began preparing. There is a quiet shift that happens when a man transitions from expansion to survival. You stop planning growth. You start planning endurance. You stop dreaming forward. You start reinforcing backward. Paul began doing both. That he reinforced what could still be defended, and he mentally released what could not. That release did not mean surrender. It meant acceptance of limitation, a rare thing for a man who had spent his entire life operating without visible boundaries. The illusion of unlimited control was gone. What remained was calculated restraint. The streets still moved beneath him. The money still flowed upward. The authority still existed. But the world that had once allowed such systems to flourish silently was now actively compressing them. Paul had built his empire in the quiet. Now the quiet was shrinking, and every shrinking space creates pressure. Chapter 3: The Men in the Spotlight. By the time the pressure around Paul Vario began to tighten from the outside, something else was happening from within. The men beneath him, the ones who once thrived quietly under his protection, were no longer content being shadows. A new generation had grown up in an era of fast money, public reputation, and visible power. They didn't want to just earn. They wanted to be seen earning, and that changed everything. Paul had built his authority on one simple principle: the less attention you attract, the longer you survive. But the men now filling his world didn't grow up with that rule carved into them. They grew up watching headlines, televised trials, and glamorous portrayals of underground life. To them, reputation had value of its own. It wasn't something to avoid, it was something to chase. These were the men who brought heat. They drove louder cars, spent money recklessly, talked a little too freely, and carried themselves like celebrities in a world that punished exposure. At first, Paul tolerated it. Youthful arrogance burns itself out, he believed. Let them feel powerful. The street always teaches its own lessons. But what he underestimated was how quickly public visibility could now turn into institutional focus. The world was no longer built on rumor. It was built on records. Each flare of attention created a trail. Each trial created a database. Each careless word entered a transcript. And transcripts don't forget. Certain men in his orbit began gaining reputations with law enforcement. Their shadows grew longer. Surveillance increased. Taps expanded. Informants became more valuable. The spotlight that once missed Paul entirely was now shining dangerously close. Not on him directly, but on the structure he had worked a lifetime to conceal. Paul watched this unfold with increasing distance. He no longer corrected behavior directly unless it became unavoidable. He let the environment deliver feedback instead. Those who learned adapted. Those who didn't became liabilities. And Paul did not protect liabilities. This was another quiet truth of his leadership. He valued stability above loyalty. If someone threatened the balance of the structure, their past contributions did not guarantee future protection. The machine mattered more than any single part. Still, what made this period so dangerous wasn't recklessness alone. It was collision. Different personalities, different ambitions, different fears were now beginning to crash into each other within the same confined network. The quiet order Paul had cultivated for decades was becoming crowded with ego, impatience, and visibility. And visibility attracts intervention at the same time. Law enforcement had begun shifting strategy yet again. They were no longer just building cases around crimes. They were building cases around relationships. Who spoke to whom? Who moved where? Who benefited when someone else fell? The spotlight wasn't looking for spectacular moments anymore. The IT was looking for patterns. And patterns always lead upward. For the first time in his career, Paul could feel that the spotlight was no longer random. It was directional, slow, persistent, unblinking. This realization forced him into a new posture, not of expansion or even defense, but of containment through separation. He began increasing the distance between himself and the men drawing the most attention. He did not cut them off entirely. That would be suspicious. He simply repositioned himself further back from their daily movement. From the outside, it appeared subtle. From his perspective, it was survival architecture. But separation doesn't erase connection. Not truly. Every phone call, every favor, every shared channel still carried the resonance of his authority. The men in the spotlight still moved through systems that ultimately bore his imprint, even if he no longer touched them directly. And this is where the trap began to close. Paul had built a world where he did not need to be seen to be powerful, but the men beneath him had built a world where power was visibility. Those two philosophies could not coexist forever. The question was no longer whether the spotlight would reach him. The question was what would reach him first, exposure or insulation. For most of his life, silence had been Paul Vario's greatest shield. It was the quiet that kept his name out of headlines, the absence that confused investigators, the restraint that allowed violence and profit to exist at a manageable distance from his own hands. Silence had worked because the world around him once moved slowly, blindly, and without coordination. But by the late 1970s, silence was losing its power. The world was listening differently now. Federal task forces were no longer divided by jurisdiction in the way they once were. Information traveled faster between agencies. Witnesses were moved, protected, traded. Cases that once died in local courts were being revived at the federal level, where patience was longer and pressure was relentless. The system had learned how to wait longer than the men it hunted. Paul felt the weight of this shift most clearly in how conversation changed. Men no longer spoke as freely in social clubs. Jokes felt forced. Information traveled slower and with more caution. Meetings were shorter, more guarded. Everyone still acted as if everything was normal, but the pauses grew longer. The questions became more careful. The certainty that once filled every room was thinning. Silence had stopped meaning safety. Now it simply meant uncertainty. What unsettled Paul most was not fear of arrest. He had prepared for that possibility his entire adult life. What unsettled him was the realization that control was becoming theoretical rather than practical. He still influenced outcomes, but the mechanics of that influence now relied on too many variables. Too many people. Too many unpredictable pressures. Every system, no matter how well designed, reaches a point where the environment outgrows it. Paul's world was reaching that point. He responded the only way he knew how, by withdrawing further into himself. He limited exposure to the absolute minimum. He reduced personal interaction. He relied more heavily on layers of communication rather than face-to-face authority. The man who had once commanded rooms with his presence now commanded from distance. Distance protected him, but it also weakened the emotional glue that had once held everything tightly together. Men who used to feel directly connected to him began to feel abstractly connected instead. Orders arrived without his voice attached to them. Decisions carried weight, but not personality. Over time, some of that loyalty shifted, not to other leaders, but to self-preservation. And self-preservation is the enemy of hierarchy. When survival becomes personal rather than collective, the structure begins to loosen from the bottom up. Paul still believed discipline could correct this. He still believed restraint could stabilize it. But the new generation beneath him did not move by his rules. They moved by opportunity, reputation, and speed, all things that created noise. Noise attracts focus, and focus eventually becomes pressured. As the spotlight intensified, Paul began to notice the difference between rumors and reality. Rumors arrive loudly and vanish quickly. Reality arrives quietly and stays. The reality now was that investigations were becoming organized in the same way his operation once had been, carefully, methodically. With overlapping roles and strategic patience, he was no longer dealing with reactive pursuit. He was dealing with systemic pursuit, the most dangerous kind. And still, from the outside, nothing dramatic happened. No dramatic arrest, no public collapse, no visible turning point. Just a slow tightening, the kind of tightening that does not announce itself. Paul understood that this phase, the quiet approach, was the most critical. It was here that mistakes would matter most, because they would not be judged in isolation. They would be evaluated as part of a long chain of logic reaching backward and upward through the structure. In this phase, one careless word could do more damage than a decade of careful silence had ever prevented. That awareness made every interaction heavier, every choice more deliberate, every flaw more dangerous. Paul was no longer navigating expansion or even competition. He was navigating entropy, the slow breakdown of the very order he had built. And entropy is not fought with intimidation. It is fought with adaptation. The question that now lingered over everything was whether his adaptation would arrive in time. There is a moment in every long-running system when the people inside it can feel the shift before they can name it. The rules haven't changed on paper. The routines still exist. The meetings still happen. The money still moves. But the certainty, the quiet confidence that tomorrow will look like yesterday, begins to thin. That was the moment Paul Vario entered as the final stretch of the 1970s approached. For decades, illusion had been his greatest weapon. The illusion that he was distant from violence. The illusion that he was removed from risk. The illusion that he was simply a neighborhood figure with influence, not an architect of systems. That illusion had protected him better than any muscle ever could. But illusions depend on belief, and belief had begun to weaken. The men in his orbit were no longer moving with the same certainty. Some had become cautious. Some had become desperate. Some had become emboldened by the very attention Paul had spent a lifetime avoiding. Contrast created instability, and instability spreads faster than discipline ever does. Paul felt it in the delays, in the hesitation before answers, in the way people now calculated before agreeing. Those small hesitations were signals. The system wasn't fracturing yet, but it was flexing under pressure. And pressure exposes weaknesses no matter how well they've been hidden. The illusion also began to fail in another way. Through memory, the past no longer stayed buried. Men who once believed their actions were sealed in silence were discovering that silence had expiration dates. Old alliances resurfaced as liabilities. Old disputes were being re-examined. Old habits were now part of recorded patterns. What had once existed only in whispered recollection was now forming into structured narrative. A narrative Paul could no longer fully control. Every powerful system relies on narrative. Who is feared? Who is respected? Who is blamed? Who is never mentioned? Paul had mastered narrative through absence. But now the narrative was being written by people outside his control. Prosecutors, analysts, journalists, historians who studied patterns rather than personalities. For the first time, his invisibility was being interpreted not as absence, but as design, and design implies intention. That was dangerous. Paul still did not panic. He had survived too many shifts to panic now. But his focus narrowed. He became less interested in expansion, less invested in ambition. His concern shifted fully toward containment of damage. Not greatest victory, just least loss. This is the hidden psychology of decline. When conquest gives way to accounting, he began mentally categorizing what could be defended and what must be sacrificed. Which relationships were still stable? Which ones had become liabilities? Which channels remained secure? Which ones had grown too exposed? Every leader eventually reaches this phase. Very few prepare for it in advance. Paul had prepared, but preparation does not eliminate consequence. It only softens the blow. From the outside, Many would later describe this period as quiet. But quiet does not mean calm. Quiet means movement has gone underground. Quiet means conflict has become internal. Quiet means decisions are being made by reduction rather than growth. Paul had entered the phase where empires stop reaching forward and start retreating inward. He still held power. He still held influence. But now those things existed in narrower spaces, and narrow spaces magnify pressure. The illusion wasn't shattered yet, but it was no longer unquestioned. And once illusion requires defense, it has already begun to die. Chapter 4. The Tightening Circle. By the time the illusion began to thin, Paul Vario had already entered a stage of life where every day felt quieter than the one before it. Not peaceful, just narrower. The rooms he moved through were smaller now. The choices fewer. The margins for error thinner than they had ever been. For decades, his world had expanded outward. Now it was folding inward. This is how the tightening circle begins. Not with sirens or headlines, but with limitation. The federal pressure that once felt distant now felt ambient. It didn't arrive dramatically. It simply became part of the atmosphere. Surveillance didn't announce itself. It lingered. Investigations didn't rush. They waited. Paul could sense it in the pauses between events, in the way news traveled slower but carried more weight. He still received visits. He still received money. He still gave direction. But every movement carried the quiet awareness that the boundaries were closer now. Where he once operated freely across wide networks, he now moved within corridors. The corridors still worked, but they no longer felt endless. And that psychological shift mattered, because men like Paul do not measure danger by emotion. They measure it by space. How much room is left to move? How many exits still exist? How many options remain unspoken? The circle was tightening. Law enforcement had learned something critical over the years. You do not dismantle an organization by chasing its loudest members. You dismantle it by compressing its environment until it cannot breathe naturally anymore. Pressure does not have to be violent to be lethal. It only has to be constant. And the pressure was constant now. More cases connected across jurisdictions. More names reappeared in unrelated investigations. More money trails intersected with regulatory systems that no longer relied on surprise, but on aggregation. Every small data point added another invisible wall around the structure Paul had built. From the outside, it still looked stable. From the inside, it felt contained. Paul's response was not confrontation. It was refinement that he simplified, reduced moving parts, eliminated unnecessary exposure, shifted responsibilities downward and outward. What once required 5 men now required 3. What once required 3 contacts now required 1 secure line. The machine became leaner, but lean machines reveal stress fractures faster. He also began limiting emotional attachment. In earlier years, he had maintained relationships carefully, not warmly, but consistently. Now, consistency became distance. He delegated not only operations, but also presence. Fewer conversations, shorter visits, less memory created in rooms where memory could later be questioned. This was the era of containment through absence. Paul also began preparing mentally for outcomes he had never allowed himself to sit with before. Not escape, not flight, but inevitability. The possibility that all long systems eventually conclude not with collapse, but with capture. That thought did not terrify him. It focused him. Fear paralyzes. Focus organizes. He began categorizing what still mattered and what no longer did. Wealth became less important than insulation. Influence became less important than silence. Prestige became irrelevant entirely. What remained essential was continuity of identity, the ability to remain who he had always been, regardless of circumstance. In this phase of life, a man no longer asks, "How far can I go?" He asks, "How much of myself can I still protect?" Outside of his world, the city was moving forward. Streets were changing, businesses changing, entire neighborhoods shifting character. The world that had once created him was slowly being erased by development, law, and demographic drift. Inside his world, however, the old mechanics still churned, slower now, but stubbornly alive. The tightening circle did not mean that everything was ending. It meant that everything was being judged by time. And time, unlike rivals or investigators, cannot be negotiated with. Pressure does not always arrive with force. Sometimes it arrives as patience. Why this stage of his life, Paul no longer measured danger by events. He measured it by stillness. Nothing dramatic was happening, and that was exactly what made the moment dangerous. There were no sudden raids on his doorstep, no urgent warnings, no phone calls filled with panic, only the slow tightening of his world into something smaller and more deliberate. This was the new shape of threat. The authorities no longer needed speed. They had time. They no longer needed spectacle. They had data. They no longer needed confession. They had correlation. For a man who had mastered the art of operating between blind spots, this was the most unsettling shift of all. Blind spots were disappearing, not through brute force, but through accumulation. Financial records layered over travel patterns. Surveillance layered over social proximity. Old names intersecting with new ones. The structure was being studied not vertically, but horizontally. Paul sensed it in ways no one could easily explain. The pauses before messages reached him, the increased formal tone in certain exchanges, the feeling that too many people, in too many places, were now calculating at once. Pressure without noise is worse than confrontation, because confrontation gives you shape. Silence gives you uncertainty. And uncertainty is corrosive. Paul responded the only way he ever had, by narrowing again. His world became quieter than it had ever been. He stopped attending unnecessary gatherings, stopped being physically present in rooms where memory could later turn into testimony. The fewer people who could say, "I saw him," the better. Invisibility was no longer a convenience that it had become an absolute requirement. The mythology of power often teaches that dominance is about presence. But Paul's life proved the opposite. The longer he lived, the more power depended on absence. People continued to act in his name, but his physical presence was increasingly rare. He became a concept more than a man, and that, in many ways, was safer. But absence also creates vacancy, and vacancy invites reinterpretation. Men beneath him began to operate with more independence, not because he had lost authority, but because he had become too distant to correct small deviations early. Without constant calibration, even disciplined systems begin drifting. Some drift horizontally into profit. Others drift vertically into exposure. Both are dangerous in different ways. Paul sensed this too. He did not reverse course. Reversing would draw attention. Instead, he made selective reappearances, brief visits, controlled conversations, carefully timed displays of authority, just enough to remind the system that he still existed at its center. Never too much, never too little. This balance became his full-time occupation. Yet even the greatest tacticians cannot control the emotional weather of the people around them. Fear had begun changing behaviors in subtle ways. Some men grew quieter. Others grew paradoxically louder, trying to outpace the pressure with movement. The same threat produced opposite reactions, and that variability was new. Variability breaks predictability. Predictability is what systems are built upon. A long-held truth in that world is this: you never fall because of your enemies. You fall because the people around you stop moving in sync. Disunity doesn't have to be violent to be fatal. It only needs to be misaligned. Paul could feel that misalignment growing. Not sharply, not suddenly, just gradually enough to be undeniable. The tightening circle was no longer only external. It was becoming internal. And for the first time, he faced a risk he had always understood but never truly experienced. Not betrayal necessarily, but fragmentation. The slow loss of cohesion that turns empires into collections of isolated actors. Despite this, Paul remained calm. That calm was not optimism. It was acceptance of complexity. He understood now that his life was no longer defined by expansion, competition, or conquest. It was defined by containment, endurance, and positioning for outcome. Most men spend their lives trying to rise. Only a few must learn how to descend without chaos. Paul was learning that descent now, quietly, strategically, without spectacle. And as the noise around him continued to fade, something else became clearer. The end, whatever shape it would take, would not arrive as an explosion. It would arrive as a conclusion. By the time Paul understood that the system had grown bigger than the man who created it, the realization did not shock him. It simply settled into place like a final piece of a puzzle that had been forming for decades. Empires always outgrow their architects. First, power feels personal, driven by instinct, discipline, and vision. But over time, Power becomes procedural. It becomes habit. It becomes routine. And once power becomes routine, it no longer belongs to anyone. It simply exists, moving through people instead of being controlled by them. Paul had spent his life designing a structure where decisions flowed without emotional interference. This was what made it efficient. But efficiency comes with a cost. When leadership becomes invisible, loyalty becomes abstract. People no longer follow the man. They follow the position, the opportunity, the survival calculation. Paul had become a symbol more than a presence. And symbols cannot correct movement. The men beneath him still spoke his name with respect, but they no longer required his voice to function. The structure executed itself. Money moved. Networks adapted. Decisions formed through consensus rather than command. This was not rebellion. It was evolution, and evolution is indifferent to legacy. The realization did not make Paul angry. Anger required believing he had lost something. But he had not lost control. He had distributed it. And distribution is permanent. The irony was unavoidable. The system he built to survive without headlines had now become too large to ever fully disappear. Even if he vanished tomorrow, the machine would continue, and that knowledge brought with it a strange peace. Fear depends on outcome. Legacy does not. Paul began preparing internally for a future that no longer required his presence in any operational sense. He no longer evaluated risk in terms of profit and loss, only in terms of timing. When the pressure would finally move from being theoretical to being irreversible, timing was his last remaining advantage. He began trimming connections without ceremony. No dramatic exits. No symbolic breaks. Simply letting certain relationships fade through distance and silence. The fewer threads that connected directly to him, the less gravity he carried in any potential collapse. This wasn't self-preservation alone, it was containment. He understood that when structures fall, they do not fall cleanly. They fracture outward. Shrapnel does the damage long after the impact. His goal was no longer to survive without consequence. That had never been realistic. His goal was to shape consequence, shape how far it traveled, shape how many lives it crossed, shape whose names remained attached. The psychological weight of this phase was different from everything before it. Earlier pressure had sharpened him. This pressure softened him, not in weakness, but in detachment. He no longer planned years ahead. Only margins. How much time before shifts became visible? How much time before patience became scrutiny? How much time before movement became momentum? He lived now inside those margins. His days became quiet by choice. The kind of quiet that does not signal retreat, only consolidation. A man stepping away without ever moving backward. The world around him continued its speed, but he began moving at the pace of conclusions. Evenings grew longer. Conversations shorter. Decisions faster but fewer. This was not exhaustion. It was final efficiency. Most men attempt to control history. Paul had reached the stage where he accepted that history only ever allows influence, not authorship, and influence fades. The only question is whether it fades as erosion or as collapse. Paul intended it to be erosion, slow, contained, almost invisible. As the system continued operating above him and around him, the irony deepened. The very invisibility that once protected him was now what made him replaceable. There were men who had never spoken to him, never seen him in person, yet acted daily inside the framework he had designed. To them, he was not a living authority, he was a starting condition. This is how legacies end long before lives do. They become background. They become assumed. They become something people stop thinking about entirely, right until the moment they vanish. And Paul, ever the strategist, understood now that disappearing gradually was the safest possible form of power. The man no longer mattered. Only the absence would. Chapter 5. When the past begins to speak. By the time the pressure began to surface in ways that could no longer be dismissed as coincidence, Paul had already lived through enough cycles of danger to recognize the shift instantly. This was not the random tension of competition. It was the deeper vibration that came when time itself began to turn against you. For decades, the past had stayed buried exactly where it was placed. Men who vanished stayed vanished. Decisions that were once urgent became distant memories. Names once whispered in dim rooms slowly dissolved into stories told with lowered voices and softened edges. The past, for a long time, had behaved obediently, but the past never stays obedient forever. It waits. Small changes began to appear first. A question asked where questions were never asked before. A stranger showing interest in corners of history no one had spoken about in years. Old connections resurfacing with unusual timing. Paul did not need direct confirmation to understand what these signs meant. He had built enough systems to recognize when one of them had begun to reverse. Attention was no longer moving away. It was turning inward. Paul's reaction was not panic. Panic belonged to men who had not planned for this phase of life. He had always known that if his name ever returned to the surface in meaningful ways, it would not be because of current behavior. It would be because the past, having aged enough to feel safe, was being reopened by people who had not lived inside it. Younger eyes, new questions, different rules. What once seemed too large to touch had now become distant enough to investigate. That was the danger of time. It makes monsters look manageable to those who never felt their presence firsthand. Paul understood immediately that this would not arrive loudly. There would be no dramatic moment where everything changed at once. It would arrive in quiet layers. Documentation surfacing, forgotten statements being revisited, old movements being reinterpreted through modern logic. History being cleaned and reassembled. And when history is reassembled, context is always the first casualty. The New World did not care how things had been justified. It did not care why men had made the choices they made. It only cared that those choices could now be documented, categorized, and displayed. Paul did not fear exposure as much as he feared translation. Because translation removes nuance. It removes survival. It removes the invisible pressures that shaped every action. The outside world. Decisions look simple. Inside, they never were. Paul spent those first months adjusting to a new set of calculations. Not about money or territory or rivals, but about memory itself. What existed now only in living minds? What existed on paper? What had been recorded without ever being fully understood? He had always controlled space, but memory lived outside space. Memory lived inside people, and people were unpredictable. He began revisiting the architecture of his own past, not seeking mistakes, but evaluating exposure points. Who still lived, who might carry fragile versions of old truth, who had incentives to reinterpret history for their own survival, who might speak not out of loyalty or betrayal, but simply because time had made them careless. Silence, after all, is not permanent. It requires maintenance. What unsettled him most was not the idea of accusations. Those had always existed in rumor form. What unsettled him was the possibility that the next version of his story would no longer belong to those who lived it. It would belong to outsiders, analysts, creators, people who marketed narratives instead of navigating realities. Paul had always known that power dies twice. First when it disappears, second when it is rewritten, and rewrites are always more dangerous than exposure. The version of him that might soon circulate would not be the man he had been. It would be a composite, simplified, sharpened, stripped of ambiguity. A symbol constructed for consumption, and symbols invite consequences far beyond those attached to people. Paul did not seek to correct this. Correcting stories only strengthens them. Instead, he returned to what had always worked best for him. Reduction, less movement, fewer connections, minimal signals. That he began stepping further back, not because he felt hunted, but because hunters only track motion. Stillness confuses them. Stillness removes pattern. That he had learned long ago that visibility was not measured by how often one is seen, but by how often one is mentioned. His goal now was to reach a stage of irrelevance so complete that curiosity would pass over him without friction. But irrelevance is far more difficult to achieve than power. Power attracts removal. Irrelevance requires patience. While attention slowly shifted, Paul observed the way the newer generation responded to stories of the old world. He noticed how fascination replaced fear, how analysis replaced caution, how curiosity had replaced survival instinct. Men who had never lived through compression zones now spoke confidently about structures they had never felt move beneath their feet. They mapped history with clean labels, unaware that nothing clean had ever existed inside it. Paul did not resent this, he simply understood the danger of it. When stories become clean, violence always follows. Not physical violence, narrative violence, reputations erased, motives flattened. entire lifetimes reduced to headlines. This form of violence is permanent. Paul had already accepted that his story would one day move without his permission. The only variable left was how distorted it would become. While doing so, that he thought often now about the men who had disappeared quietly from his life over the years. Some had brought their own endings. Some had simply left and never returned. Others had faded into silence without explanation. At the time, each disappearance had felt definitive. Now he understood that nothing is ever fully definitive. Even vanishing leaves residue, and residue always hardens into narrative. As the outside world began reopening corridors that had once been carefully sealed, Paul entered the most unusual phase of his life. One where his greatest enemy was not law, not rivals, not betrayal, but interpretation. The world does not punish what it cannot define, but once defined, control is impossible. Paul did not fear his reflection in the story that was assembling, that he feared the parts that would be missing, because the missing parts always grow into monsters of their own. Memory does not arrive like a storm. It arrives like fog, slowly, quietly, indiscriminately. By the time you realize you are standing inside it, visibility is already gone. That was the sensation Paul began living with as his past started resurfacing in fragments across conversations, investigations, and quiet whispers that traveled along networks he no longer controlled. Being remembered is not the same as being known. What resurfaces is never the full truth. It is only the parts that survived other people's fear, loyalty, and self-preservation. Paul had always understood that his story would eventually be told. Every figure who moves inside power structures becomes a story at some point. The mistake most men make is believing they will get to shape it. Paul knew better. Stories shape themselves. They grow sharper where they were once blurred. They grow cruel where they were once complicated. And they always outlive the men who inspired them. The first public retellings carried familiar distortions, simplifications, clean timelines, convenience in cause and effect. These versions did not anger him. They confirmed what he already knew. People do not want truth. They want coherence. They want beginnings, middle, end. They want villains that fit inside a paragraph. Paul did not fit inside a paragraph. No one who survives long enough ever does. What unsettled him was not that his name was being revisited. It was that the new versions of him carried certainty. Certainty is always a lie. Reality is never certain. It is layered, contradictory, built of compromises stacked so tightly they appear solid from a distance. Certainty meant the story had stopped breathing, and once a story stops breathing, it becomes dangerous to anyone still inside it. Paul lived now in a strange split existence. To the outer world, he was a historical figure being reassembled by people who had never seen him in motion. To the inner world of those who had lived inside the system with him, he was still a quiet presence, rarely discussed, but silently acknowledged. Point two versions of him were now circulating. Point one was loud, point one was real, and they no longer recognized each other. He never attempted to correct this. Correction implies participation. Participation creates relevance. Relevance invites scrutiny. He wanted none of that. Instead, he focused on density, on compressing his world until it fit inside a routine that revealed nothing. Days became repetitive by design. Movement was minimal. Decisions were automated. Emotional range narrowed. This was not depression. It was discipline. The same discipline that had once built networks was now being used to dissolve visibility. He learned to move through time like a shadow moves through light, not by speed, but by alignment. What grew heavier was not fear. It was interpretation. Every time he heard a modern version of an old event, the weight did not come from inaccuracy alone. It came from how confident the inaccuracy sounded. Confidence is contagious. Once enough people agree on a version of reality, it becomes reality for everyone who comes after. Paul realized that his story was no longer his. It had become an asset. Assets are traded. Assets are reshaped to fit demand, and demand always prefers clarity over truth. More than once, he considered whether silence was still the correct strategy, whether absence still prevented distortion or now actively enabled it. But each time, the conclusion was the same. Engagement would not restore accuracy. It would simply accelerate narrative velocity. There was no winning this phase, only outlasting it. Paul had built his life around the idea that survival was not about strength, but about positioning. He had always positioned himself one step ahead of danger. Now, for the first time, danger was not something he could reposition against, because this danger was not physical. It was symbolic, and symbols cannot be outrun. What he could still control was his behavior inside obscurity. The quieter he became, the more the story of him would grow louder without feedback. People tend to mistrust a story that cannot provoke reaction. Silence, when sustained long enough, causes doubt to resurface. Was the monster real? Was the legend exaggerated? Was the danger ever truly what it was said to be? Silence plants these questions. Paul let the silence grow, that he did not deny, that he did not correct. He simply existed beyond the spectacle. What the world did with his name was no longer his burden. What mattered now was maintaining the final structure he had spent his life perfecting, an existence that produced no new material. No new incentives. No new consequences. Only stillness, only time. And time, unlike enemies or authorities or even betrayal, asks nothing from you. It only takes. Paul had reached the stage where his only strategic opponent was inevitability. And inevitability always wins. The wisdom, if there was any left to apply, was not in resisting that truth, but in choosing how gently to step into it. The strange truth about systems is that they remember even when people choose to forget. Paul had spent most of his life designing invisible pathways, routes through which decisions, influence, and protection could travel without ever revealing their source. He never built a machine that required him to remain visible. In fact, the greatest success of his design was that it could continue without him standing at its center. But what no architect ever truly controls is memory inside structure. Even when individuals vanish, the habits they leave behind persist. Even when leadership changes, the logic that shaped past decisions quietly continues forward. These are the fingerprints no one ever fully erases. And now, years removed from his most active years, Paul began to sense that the system remembered him even when people no longer spoke his name aloud. Not in loyalty, not in threat, but in configuration. Each time a familiar discipline appeared in unexpected places, each time a familiar philosophy re-emerged under a new face, each time a familiar response repeated itself without instruction, he saw his old thinking still breathing, that a system that remembers its maker does not honor him. It simply echoes him. Paul no longer existed as a man within most of the structure. He existed as a pattern. And patterns are more dangerous than people because patterns cannot be arrested, confronted, or reasoned with. They simply continue. What unsettled him was not the idea that his influence persisted. Influence always does. What unsettled him was that he could no longer redirect it. The flow, once released, had chosen its own direction. That was the final cost of building anything large enough to outlive you. At first, this realization brought a faint sense of control, the comfort of knowing that what he created had not collapsed the moment he stepped back. But over time, that comfort twisted into something heavier, responsibility. Because when something continues after you lose control of it, the consequences are no longer shaped by your judgment, yet your name remains attached in memory. This is the stage where builders and destroyers become indistinguishable to history. Paul had always separated intent from outcome in his mind. Intent mattered. Strategy mattered. Context mattered. But history does not preserve context. It preserves results. And results are blunt instruments. He began to understand that the most difficult phase of power is not acquiring it, and not even losing it, but existing long enough to watch it misrepresent you. There were moments now when he heard new interpretations of old actions that would have been unrecognizable to the man he once was. Decisions once born of containment were now portrayed as dominance. Strategic restraint reframed as manipulation. Silence recast as command. It was not flattering. It was simplifying. Simplification is the enemy of truth. Paul did not attempt to correct these distortions. He understood that once a system chooses a narrative, overriding it requires becoming a participant again, and participation would only sharpen the distortion. The only form of resistance left was to remain what he had become, absent. Absence does not rewrite stories, but it causes friction inside them. People grow uncertain when the subject of their conclusions never reacts. Silence denies confirmation. Silence introduces doubt, and in the world of narratives, doubt is the only remaining weapon. against certainty. Paul used it carefully. He withdrew further not from fear, but from principle. Each layer of disappearance forced those who spoke his name to rely more heavily on speculation. And speculation weakens confidence over time. Confidence is what turns stories into convictions. He did not want his story to become a conviction, that he wanted it to remain uncertain. The irony was complete. A man who once specialized in control now depended entirely upon uncontrollability for protection. This was not cowardice. That it was the final tactic of someone who had reached the outermost edge of consequence. Paul lived now in deliberate smallness. Not because his actions had become small, but because the stage that once amplified them no longer needed him. The machine ran at scale. He had become excess. And excess is always the first thing history discards. If there was peace in this phase, it lay in knowing that he had outlived the version of himself that demanded history's attention. What remained was a quiet continuity of breath and time, neither powerful nor powerless, just present, and presence, when stripped of command, becomes strangely honest. Chapter 6. The Weight of What Cannot Be Recovered. There comes a stage in every long life where loss no longer arrives as a shock. It arrives as a quiet measurement, not of what is gone, but of what can never be restored. Paul had reached that stage without ceremony. It did not announce itself. It simply settled into his routine, shaping the way time felt beneath his feet. He had lost many things over the years, some by choice, some by necessity, some simply by outlasting them. But there is one kind of loss that weighs heavier than all others: the loss of return. The knowledge that no matter how clearly a path is remembered, it can never be walked again. No matter how vividly a moment replays in the mind, it remains trapped in a version of the world that no longer exists. Paul found himself thinking more often about beginnings than endings, about quiet early days when motion still felt voluntary rather than inevitable, when directions were chosen instead of inherited, when identities were built instead of defended. The danger of reflection is not nostalgia. It is comparison, and comparison exposes what time has taken without ever asking permission. There were streets he could no longer walk, rooms he could no longer enter, voices he could no longer answer, not because he feared them, but because they no longer recognized him. The world that once required his awareness had moved into a form that did not require his presence. The mechanisms he had studied had evolved. The languages had changed. The signals had transformed. That he was fluent in systems that no longer existed. And fluency without relevance feels like anecdotal wealth. Paul felt the weight of this dislocation not as sadness, but as distance from himself. The man he had been now felt like a biography rather than a memory. Someone he once embodied but no longer inhabited. For the first time, he was not adapting, that he was maintaining. Maintenance is not progress, but it is survival. And survival, once stripped of ambition, becomes preservation of function rather than pursuit of purpose. Paul structured his days with intent, but without horizon. There was no future he was attempting to shape now, only a present he was attempting to keep aligned. He measured life in quiet intervals of stability. Morning arrived, routine held, night passed. This was his new arithmetic. The losses that weighed heaviest were not the obvious ones. Not power, not status, not reach. Those were illusions even when they felt real. The losses that lingered were subtler. The erosion of velocity, the absence of long-form consequence, the quiet dulling of anticipation. He no longer anticipated anything in the way younger men do, with hunger, with projection, with imagined reward. Now, anticipation had become observational. What will change next? Not for me, but around me. Paul did not envy the future. Envy requires desire. He no longer desired destinations, only sustained movement through time without impact. He had reached the age where conflict offered no excitement, only disruption. Where confrontation promised no resolution, only noise. Where recognition brought no pride, only risk. The world had once felt like a map to be navigated. Now it felt like weather to be endured, and like weather, it could not be mastered, only predicted imperfectly. Paul's greatest realization during this phase was that power once had meaning because it offered him leverage over uncertainty. Now, uncertainty had become his only remaining constant. He could not influence it. He could only adjust to its pressure. This did not frighten him. What frightened him was how natural it began to feel. Humans are not designed to live without projection, without imagining forward motion, without building towards something unseen. When projection disappears, identity begins to thin. Paul felt this thinning most sharply in silence, in the pauses between conversations, in the gaps between days, in the spaces between thoughts. Where once his mind had moved ahead of time, now it often returned to it. He caught himself noticing details he once filtered through instinct: shadows lengthening across walls, the modulation in voices, the weight of objects left undisturbed for weeks. These were not distractions. They were his new anchors. When a man outlives the versions of himself that once defined him, he begins living inside micropresence. Small awareness, narrow gravity. Paul had entered this phase without resistance, and that, more than anything, told him how far he had traveled from the man he once was. Silence does not arrive all at once. It grows, first as a gap between conversations, then as space between names, then, slowly, as the absence of urgency. Paul had lived his life surrounded by pressure for so long that he once believed silence was weakness, the domain of men who had nothing left to protect. Now he understood its real nature. Silence is not weakness. Silence is exposure. When the sound of command fades, when routine no longer vibrates with risk, when the mind is no longer crowded with calculation, what remains is not peace. It is self. And self, when confronted without distraction, is heavier than any enemy. Paul now lived in conversations that ended without resolution, in rooms where no one waited for instruction, in nights that passed without alerts, updates, or reactionary thoughts. The silence began teaching him things he had never needed to know before: what it felt like to be unnecessary, what it felt like to observe instead of direct, what it felt like to exist without momentum behind every movement. Men who live inside systems rarely experience this. Their environment defines their internal rhythm. Their pulse syncs with consequence. When that synchronization breaks, the nervous system struggles to recalibrate. Paul felt this recalibration deeply. At first, it came as restlessness, a compulsion to move despite having nowhere to go, a desire to initiate activity simply to restore the sensation of motion. But motion without purpose collapses quickly. Then came stillness, not imposed, chosen. And it was in that stillness that Paul encountered his most difficult opponent, himself. Without function, he had always known who he was in motion: a strategist, a listener, a decision-maker, a calibrator of risk. Every identity he had ever carried required interaction. Influence requires contact. Command requires response. Even silence, once, had been a negotiation tactic. Now silence was no longer tactical. It was existential. He realized that everything he had once believed about himself had been defined externally. By reaction, by resistance, by adaptation, by pressure. Without pressure, he had no ready-made definition. This was not a crisis. It was a reckoning. Some nights, he would sit without intention, simply listening to the subtle sounds of space, the way walls settle with temperature, the distant movement of unseen life outside the window, the rhythm of breath moving through quiet. These sounds were not remarkable, but they were real. And reality without distortion is unsettling. In the absence of command, memory becomes louder. Not dramatic memory, not the scenes that define biographies, but the small, unedited sequences that never made it into stories. The way light once shifted across an unfamiliar room, the hesitation before certain decisions, the subtle sensation of knowing a door had closed long before the body had left the room. Silence teaches through repetition. It removes urgency and replaces it with continuity. And continuity forces acknowledgement. Paul began to understand something few men ever do while they are still alive: that identity is not built. It is shed. Every version of yourself you survive becomes excess. What remains after shedding is not power. It is residue. And residue is honest. He was no longer angry at the world. Anger requires belief in interruption. The belief that something is actively blocking your will. Paul no longer believed his will was being blocked, only that it had completed its arc. His will had traveled as far as it could. The silence also revealed truths about fear. Most men chase power because they fear fragility. They build structures to avoid helplessness. But silence revealed a deeper layer. That fragility is not avoided through influence. It is postponed. Eventually, every structure removes itself from beneath you, and you meet fragility anyway. Paul met it with attention rather than resistance. His body had slowed. His senses sharpened. His perception of time stretched. Minutes felt wider. Hours carried texture. Crisis had once compressed time into tight corridors of decision. Silence expanded it into open terrain that he walked through that terrain cautiously, without projection, without destination. This was not surrender. This was arrival. Machines are honest about what they do. They transform input into output. They follow logic. They obey structure. Paul had once lived as an extension of a machine he helped construct. He knew exactly what functions he served. He processed, filtered, predicted, contained, but now the machine existed without him, and he existed without the machine. For the first time, Paul encountered himself outside systems, not as an operator, not as command, not as architect, as a man. This distinction did not arrive as revelation. It arrived as disorientation, a long, quiet confusion about who he was when no one depended on him and no one resisted him. He realized just how rare it is for men like him to ever encounter themselves outside of context. Most die inside their roles. They exit through consequence, through collapse, through interruption. Paul had stepped out through endurance, and endurance leaves no ceremony behind. What remained was the man underneath, the man who had once chosen these paths before they had names, the man who had believed control would solve uncertainty, the man who had confused structural dominance with internal resolution. These realizations arrived slowly, without accusation. Silence does not accuse. It only exposes. Paul recognized now that the harshest illusions he had ever carried were not about others. They were about permanence. He had believed permanence lived inside systems, then inside institutions, then inside reputation. None of those had survived unchanged. The only thing that endured with consistency was behavior. Behavior repeated becomes identity. Identity repeated becomes story. Story repeated becomes myth. Myth eventually dissolves. Behavior never does. This was the last truth Paul absorbed without resistance. He had been who he had been because he had repeated himself enough times to become predictable. And predictability, extended long enough, masquerades as destiny. But destiny is just consistency interpreted emotionally. Paul was no longer consistent. And in that inconsistency, he became human again, not in sentiment, but in limitation. That he was limited in reach, limited in speed, limited in visibility, limited in consequence. And limitation stripped away illusion faster than any authority ever had. What remained was not regret. Regret implies judgment. What remained was assessment, clear, unforgiving, neutral, and in that neutrality, there was a strange peace, not forgiveness, not absolution, just recognition. Paul, for the first time in his life, no longer belonged to outcome. He belonged only to time. Chapter 7. When the past is no longer a weapon. There comes a moment in every long life when the past loses its power to threaten. Not because it has been forgiven, not because it has been erased, but because it has already done everything it can do. Paul reached that moment quietly, without ceremony, without relief. The past did not vanish. It simply stopped advancing. For decades, the past had been a tool of leverage. It lived inside secrets, inside favors owed, inside quiet understandings that never needed to be spoken aloud. It shaped decisions without ever appearing in rooms. It influenced outcomes without ever requiring movement. The past had been a weapon precisely because it remained unfinished. Now it was finished. Nothing new could rise from it anymore. That realization did not arrive with comfort. It arrived with a strange emptiness. Paul had spent most of his life negotiating with the weight of what had already happened, using memory as currency, caution as shield, silence as strategy. But when the past stopped demanding attention, it left behind a vacuum no calculation could fill. The future no longer needed to be defended from yesterday. The conflicts that once required constant calibration had resolved themselves through time alone. People who once carried risk had aged into irrelevance. Lines that once felt volatile had gone quiet. Even the rumors had lost the sharpness that once made them dangerous. History had done what no authority ever could. It had cooled everything. Paul learned that danger does not fade because it is defeated. It fades because it becomes exhausting to maintain. There was no longer an audience for revenge, and no longer an incentive for correction, and no longer a reward for disturbance. He stood inside a version of life where everything that once mattered still existed, but now without urgency. And it was urgency, he realized, that had given everything its meaning. Without urgency, purpose began to drift. Paul noticed how often his thoughts now returned to questions without answers he no longer needed. What had once felt unresolved had become closed simply because time had closed it. Not by justice, not by admission, but by entropy. Time is the only force that defeats intention. Intent fades, memory fades, pressure fades. Even fear cannot survive forever without reinforcement. Paul began to understand that the most powerful closure he would ever receive was not resolution, but diminishment. The past did not correct itself. It shrank, and as it shrank, it released him from its grip. He no longer planned days based on avoidance. He no longer measured movement based on caution. He no longer calculated words based on who might be listening. He had crossed into a phase of life where risk had become abstract, present in theory, absent in practice. This is a dangerous realization for a mind that once lived entirely in anticipation. First, it made him restless. A man trained to scan for threats will feel unbalanced when the horizon goes still. Silence, once interpreted as danger, now stretched endlessly without explanation. The absence of pressure made him question whether the absence itself was the pressure. But weeks passed, then months, and nothing moved toward him. Paul began to accept what once felt impossible, that the chapter in which the past functioned as an active enemy had ended. It was not mercy that ended it was irrelevance. The world does not punish forever. It forgets. And forgetting is more absolute than any sentence. What unsettled him most was not that the past no longer mattered. It was that the present now required something different from him. Something he had never cultivated. Presence without defense. He had lived so long inside reactive motion that he had never learned how to simply exist without bracing. The absence of pressure did not feel like freedom at first. It felt like disorientation. A battlefield without enemies feels unnatural to a soldier who has never known peace. Paul felt that disorientation daily. He would wake expecting tension that no longer arrived. He would listen for movement that never came. He would prepare for resistance that did not materialize. And slowly, reluctantly, he began to recalibrate. The past became something he could observe rather than negotiate. That he could think about it without preparing defenses. That he could remember without calculating consequences. This did not bring comfort. It brought distance. Distance is not forgiveness. Distance is simply the quiet understanding that what once controlled you no longer does. Paul did not redefine himself during this phase. There was no dramatic transformation, no declaration of change. He simply moved through certain spaces without feeling followed by echoes. The room of his own life grew quieter, and in that quiet, for the first time, he faced a future that did not require calculation. The future, he realized, had become empty space, not hopeful, not threatening, just unoccupied. And empty space is the most difficult terrain for a man built on structure. Anticipation had ruled Paul's inner world for most of his life. It shaped the way he slept, the way he listened, the way he moved through rooms. Every sound once carried a question. Every delay once implied intention. Every silence once suggested threat. Anticipation was not anxiety for him. It was a survival instrument, a constant forward-leaning posture against events that had not yet arrived. But now, anticipation had nowhere to lean. The days no longer carried hidden countdowns. The nights no longer asked him to measure risk against time. There were no shifts in pattern that required deciphering. No new players whose motives demanded interpretation. The future, once a living opponent, had softened into an unknown that asked nothing from him. And that was the problem. A man who lives by anticipation never learns how to rest inside certainty, because certainty rarely exists in his world. Paul had trained himself to expect disruption as the natural state of things. Stillness, once rare, had now become constant. And constancy felt unnerving. In quiet moments, he caught himself bracing unconsciously. Shoulders square, breathing shallow. The posture of readiness held long after readiness was no longer required. His body had learned a language that the present no longer spoke. Unlearning that language became his new, unspoken work that he began to move deliberately slowly through ordinary routines, not to test danger, but to test absence. To prove, again and again, that nothing followed interruption. That pauses did not invite intrusion. That delay did not produce consequence. Sometimes he would stop mid-task and simply remain still, waiting for the familiar internal alarm that never sounded. The silence that followed was not dramatic. It was flat, featureless, and over time, it became real. Paul discovered that living without anticipation was far more difficult than living under pressure. Pressure gives form to time. It sharpens decision. It gives weight to seconds. Without it, time stretches without resistance. Minutes feel longer. Hours expand. Nothing demands to be faster. Nothing requires preparation. This was not the kind of freedom most people imagine. It was not relief. It was exposure to emptiness without distraction. An open field where instinct had nothing left to measure against. Paul found himself thinking now not about survival, but about endurance of a different kind. How long could a man remain inside stillness without trying to recreate motion? How long before the mind invents threats simply to justify movement? The temptation was strong. There were moments when he felt the urge to disrupt his own quiet, to provoke some change, to initiate some instability, to reintroduce the familiar rhythm of reaction and control. But he resisted, not out of discipline, but out of understanding that he had not escaped consequence just to manufacture it again. Learning to live without anticipation meant learning to accept uncertainty without pressure. A paradox in itself. He had once believed uncertainty only existed in moments of danger. Now he understood that uncertainty is the natural state of life. Danger merely sharpens it into urgency. Without urgency, uncertainty became soft, and softness takes longer to trust. Paul noticed how his thoughts began drifting differently. Where once his mind scanned outward, it now turned inward in unfamiliar ways. Memory returned without warning. Emotion surfaced without strategy attached. There were moments when he felt things he had once filtered past instantly. Not because he was unfeeling, but because feeling had always been secondary to function. Now there was no function demanding priority, only experience. This shift unsettled him more than any confrontation ever had. Men trained for conflict understand clarity. You know where you stand. You know who stands opposite you. You understand the rules of engagement, even when rules are broken. But there were no rules for this phased, no opponent, no objective, no reward. Only time passing without resistance. Paul began to realize that anticipation had once protected him from confronting the slower truths of existence. Aging, erosion, the quiet narrowing of physical and emotional appetite. Anticipation is a narcotic. It keeps the mind ahead of the body. It delays awareness of limit. Now the body spoke louder. Movement slowed. Recovery took longer. Small discomforts lingered. None of this frightened him. What unsettled him was how gently it arrived. There was no dramatic moment of collapse. No sharp decline. Just a gradual rebalancing where strength and intention were no longer synchronized. Anticipation, once the engine of his life, had finally lost traction, and he was still learning how to stand without it. Days now felt like open water. No shore in immediate sight. No storm either. Just quiet movement beneath him. He floated rather than advanced. And floating, for a man who had always measured progress in distance traveled, felt like stagnation. But stagnation is only another name for unfamiliar pace. He had measured reality his entire life in terms of speed and outcome. Now he was measuring it in duration. How long can silence last? How long can peace remain unchallenged? How long can a man exist without needing to prepare? Paul did not yet have answers. He only knew that the future had ceased arriving like an attack, and learning how to walk toward it without armor would take longer than any battle ever had. For most of his life, Paul had lived in a state of forward tension. Not fear exactly, something sharper. Anticipation. The constant expectation that the next turn would demand response, that the next day would arrive already carrying consequence. Anticipation had shaped the way he stood, the way he listened, the way his mind moved through time. Now, for the first time, anticipation began to collapse in on itself. Nothing waited at the edge of tomorrow. No signal approached. No reaction had to be prepared in advance. It first. the absence felt unnatural. His instincts continued to reach for threat where none existed. He would replay conversations, searching for meaning that was no longer hidden. He would measure silence as if it were building toward impact. But silence did not advance. It only remained. Paul began to realize that anticipation had not only trained him to survive, it had trained him to misinterpret peace. Peace felt suspicious, too open, too undefined. When a man spends his life inside compression, expansion feels like exposure. Without anticipation, the muscles of the mind relax in uneven stages. Some days, he felt relief without knowing why. Other days, he felt irritation at the absence of urgency. For the first time, he faced a horizon that did not demand strategy. And without strategy, his internal architecture struggled to find balance. That he noticed subtle changes in himself. The way his breath deepened, the way his thoughts slowed between impulses. Even his reactions became unfamiliar to him, no longer driven by positioning, but by inclination. He had lived so long according to necessity that preference had become foreign. What did he actually want now? The question arrived without urgency and lingered without answer. Paul discovered that desire itself fades without conflict. Desire thrives on barriers. When access becomes available without resistance, it loses its urgency. The hunger that once drove him no longer knew where to aim. That he had lived inside pressure for so long that pressure had become identity. Now identity was loosening. He began to feel time differently. In earlier years, time had been something to outrun, compress, manipulate. Every moment was linked to outcome. Now, time arrived without agenda. Minutes stretched. Hours felt heavy, not with meaning, but with presence. He began walking without destination. Not to escape, not to observe, just to move through space without narrative attached. At first, this unsettled him deeply. Movement without purpose had once been waste. Now, it became practice. He began to understand that removing anticipation does not reveal boredom. It reveals texture. Subtle variations in air, the shift of light across surfaces, the sound of life occurring around you without reference to your own story. He was no longer the center of movement, and this realization, though quiet, was the most radical shift of his life. When a man is no longer the axis around which decisions turn, he must locate himself in an entirely different way. Paul was learning to exist without commanding relevance. It felt like becoming invisible all over again, but without the protection that invisibility once provided. This invisibility was not tactical. It was natural, and natural invisibility is irreversible. Paul no longer underestimated how deeply anticipation had shaped his emotional economy. Without it, emotions began behaving differently. Surprise returned, not as danger, but as novelty. Concern emerged, not as paranoia, but as awareness. Even laughter appeared more easily. Detached from performance, he realized that much of his seriousness had not been temperament. It had been readiness. Readiness for interruption, readiness for judgment, readiness for consequence. Now he was no longer required to be ready, and readiness, when it dissolves, exposes vulnerability beneath it. This vulnerability did not manifest as feared. It manifested as uncertainty about self. Who am I when nothing is waiting to happen? It is one of the most difficult questions a human being can face, not because it is painful, but because it is unstructured. There is no external variable to react against. The answer must rise from within. Paul had never been required to answer that before. Life had always answered for him. Now, slowly, without announcement, life had stepped back, and he stood alone with the echo of his own continuity, not tragic, not triumphant, merely intact. Chapter 8. When identity loses its audience. Identity behaves differently when it is no longer being watched. For most of his life, Paul's sense of self had been shaped not only by what he did, but by who observed him doing it. There is a subtle power that forms when your existence creates reaction in others: approval, fear, resistance, loyalty, interpretation. These reactions act as mirrors, and over time, a man begins living inside the reflection. But now, there was no reflection in witnesses to no audience. The silence that had once felt empty now felt unchallenged. Paul began to understand that much of what he had once considered himself had only existed in contrast to others. Authority only exists when someone is beneath it. Influence only exists when someone is moved by it. Reputation only exists when someone carries it forward. Without observers, identity stops performing. And when identity stops performing, it becomes something else entirely. At first, this felt like disappearance that he noticed it in subtle ways. The way he chose his clothes without considering how they might be perceived. The way he spoke without evaluating how his words might land. Even the way he walked changed, no longer calibrated to presence or purpose, but shaped by comfort and timing alone. The man he had once been required an environment to exist. This version did not. It unsettled him to realize that so much of what he had once protected relentlessly did not follow him into solitude. Titles had no temperature here. Reputation carried no weight. There was no currency of recognition in rooms where no one was watching. For years, he had believed that invisibility was power. Only now did he understand that invisibility is also freedom from relevance. And freedom from relevance does not always feel like freedom. It often feels like ambiguity. Without an audience, he no longer received confirmation of his place in the world. No reward arrived for restraint. No consequence followed action. His presence did not tilt rooms toward reaction. He occupied space without altering it. This was the purest form of equality he had ever known. No advantaged, no disadvantage. Just being. Paul noticed how language shifted when there was no audience. He no longer described situations. He experienced them directly. There was no need to translate reality into narrative because no one would be handed the story afterward. This was living without retelling. Without retelling, moments ceased to accumulate meaning through repetition. They existed once and then vanished. This finality made even small experiences feel complete in a way they never had before. Nothing had to be remembered. Nothing had to be converted into leverage. Nothing had to be protected for later. This terrified and liberated him in equal measure. When a man loses his audience, he no longer has to maintain coherence. Contradictions do not need explanation. Mood does not need framing. Change does not require justification. Paul began to feel this looseness enter his decisions. He would change plans without reason. He would abandon thoughts midway without needing closure. He could reverse direction without interpreting it as failure. For most of his life, consistency had been survival. Now inconsistency became honesty. That he realized how exhausting performance had been. The invisible posture he had maintained even when alone, because habit had made solitude feel like another stage. Now the stage was gone. And without a stage, there was no role. Paul did not know what to call himself anymore. Not because his past had faded, but because it no longer functioned as instruction. Identity had once told him how to move. Now movement arrived without consulting identity. This was disorienting in a fundamental way. There were days when he felt lighter than he ever had before, and others when the lack of gravity made him feel unmoored. He began to understand that audience does not merely observe identity, that it stabilizes it. Without that external stabilizer, the self becomes fluid, not unstable, but changeable. And changeability renders definitions useless. Paul was no longer definable in the old sense that he could not describe himself through role, through history, through expectation. What remained was something far quieter and far harder to articulate: presence without narrative, existence without destination. And for the first time, his life was no longer something that could be summarized, that it could only be felt. There is a freedom that comes not from being seen, but from no longer being recognizable at all. Paul began to feel this freedom not as excitement, but as unfamiliar ease. For most of his life, recognition had arrived before he did. A room would shift before he spoke. Silence would rearrange itself around his presence. People would measure their words with an awareness that preceded conversation. Now, that gravity was gone, that he could enter spaces without narrative preceding him. He could leave without imprint. The world no longer adjusted itself around his arrival. At first, this felt like subtraction. Then, slowly, it began to feel like relief. That to be unrecognizable meant he no longer had to carry the weight of continuity. No one expected him to remain consistent with a past they did not know. No one required him to perform memory. He could move through moments without being compared to earlier versions of himself. This was not anonymity in the technical sense, that it was anonymity of expectation. Paul had once been anticipated. Now he was simply encountered. That distinction changed everything that he noticed it most clearly in the way people spoke to him without hesitation. Their sentences were not shaped by caution. Their tone was not weighted by calculation. Even disagreement arrived without the careful padding that once surrounded him. He was being treated as a person rather than a position, and that, paradoxically, felt more intimate than any authority he had ever held at the same time. This new freedom created its own kind of vertigo. When identity is no longer reinforced by recognition, it begins to feel provisional. Each interaction becomes a fresh negotiation of self rather than an extension of an established form. Paul realized how much stability he had once drawn from being known, even when being known was dangerous. Familiarity, even hostile familiarity, creates a kind of anchor. To be unknown is to float. Some days, floating felt like weightlessness. Other days, it felt like drift. He began to sense the strange truth that identity is not something we carry alone. It is something co-authored through repetition and response. When those responses disappear, the text of self begins to fade between definitions. Paul was not becoming someone else. He was becoming undefined. There were moments when this unsettled him deeply. Without definition, he could not anticipate his own reactions. He could not predict what he would feel in a situation because feeling was no longer constrained by habit. For most of his life, reaction had followed pattern. Now, reaction followed mood. This spontaneity felt fragile, and yet, it was real that he began to understand that the freedom of being unrecognizable is not the freedom to become powerful again. It is the freedom to become inefficient, to waste time, to change direction without reason, to arrive late without meaning, to leave early without explanation. These small inefficiencies, once unacceptable, now became acts of quiet rebellion against a life once measured entirely by consequence. Paul discovered that he liked the feeling of being slightly out of alignment with everything, not having to match rhythm, not having to keep pace, not having to justify his timing against anyone else's expectation that he could be early, he could be late, he could be absent, and no narrative would rush to fill the gap. This was the freedom he had never imagined power would deny him, because power demands coherence. Obscurity allows fragmentation, and fragmentation, he realized, is where humanity actually lives. That he felt this most acutely when old impulses surfaced and then dissolved without expression. A sharp thought might arise. Once upon a time it would have triggered response. Now it simply passed through him and vanished. No ripple followed. This was not restraint. That it was irrelevance of impulse. The impulse had nothing left to operate upon, and without a field to manifest in, it lost urgency. Paul began to experience himself as a series of internal weather patterns rather than as a controlled system. Some days were clear, some unpredictable, some heavy without reason. But none required management beyond simple endurance. He was no longer running a machine, that he was inhabiting a climate, and climates do not obey commands. They drift. This frightened the last remaining part of him that belief control was synonymous with safety. But even that belief began to loosen its grip. Control had once protected him from threat. Now there was no threat left to justify it. The strange freedom of being unrecognizable, he learned, is that nothing is demanded of you anymore. But nothing is promised either. You are not required to succeed, but you are also no longer guaranteed significance. You become free from both praise and consequence. This double-edged freedom reshaped his inner world slowly. He stopped seeking validation, even from himself. He stopped measuring days against productivity. He stopped evaluating behavior against long-term meaning. Some days existed only to be passed through, and that, he discovered, was not emptiness. That it was saturation with the present moment. When nothing is demanded of you, even the smallest sensation becomes complete. Light across a wall, sound in the distance, movement of breath for the first time. Paul was no longer living forward or backward. He was living inside. There is a moment in every long transformation when you realize that the version of you that once dominated your life has quietly stepped out of the frame. Not erased, not destroyed, simply no longer centered. Paul reached that moment without knowing when it had happened. One day, he noticed that the man he had been no longer arrived first in his thoughts. The old self had become background. He could still remember him clearly. The posture, the instincts, the internal rhythm of command and calculation. But memory no longer carried weight. It carried texture. Like recalling a role once played so thoroughly that it became mistaken for identity. Now the role had ended, and what remained was the actor, standing off stage, no longer required to perform. The vanishing point is not disappearance. It is repositioning. Perspective shifts until what once felt massive becomes distant. The old self did not collapse. It receded. Paul realized that for the first time, he was not waking up as a continuation of yesterday. The forward motion of identity had slowed enough to reveal space between who he was and who he had been. In that space, there was no pressure to bridge the gap. He did not feel the need to unify these versions of himself. They could coexist without conflict. The sharpness that once defined his decisions had softened into observation. He could think about his former life without feeling obligated to defend or condemn it. Distance had removed moral urgency and replaced it with neutrality. And neutrality, in many ways, was the final form of freedom. He had once believed that becoming something required force. That evolution demanded resistance. That survival was a continuous state of opposition. Now he understood that the most permanent changes occur when resistance disappears. The old self dissolved not because it was defeated, but because it was no longer needed. He sensed this vanishing most clearly when he no longer felt tempted to narrate his own life internally. The running commentary that had once accompanied every decision had faded. He was no longer evaluating his actions against a version of himself preserved in memory. Action no longer required identity, it only required presence. This realization altered his sense of time completely. Earlier, time had been a sequence of cause and effect. Now it felt more like a field, something he moved through rather than something he advanced along. The future no longer pulled him. The past no longer pushed him. That he existed in the pressureless center between the two. If there were moments when he searched for the old tension, out of habit, he would think back to events that once would have ignited immediate response. Now they arrived in the mind like distant images, vivid but weightless. The emotion had detached itself from the memory. This detachment was not cruelty. It was completion. Paul realized that identity is not something we carry forward untouched. It decays naturally when no longer reinforced. What he had once thought of as him had depended on constant friction to remain solid. Without friction, that solidity had evaporated, leaving behind something lighter, more adaptable, less defined. That he did not feel empty, but he did feel unfinished, in the most honest sense. Not unfinished like a project waiting for completion. Unfinished like open air waiting for weathered. He began to understand that the vanishing of the old self is not a singular event. It is an ongoing negotiation between memory and immediacy. Some days, fragments of the old identity still surfaced, habits of language, reflexes of caution, patterns of interpretation, but they no longer controlled him. They passed through him. He did not correct them. He did not amplify them. That he allowed them to dissolve on their own. This was not mastery. This was release. There is a stage of life where struggle turns inward, where the opponent is not fate or others or circumstance, but attachment to who you once needed to be. Paul had passed through that struggle without battle. The old self had not been overthrown. It had simply lost relevance, and relevance, once gone, never returns in the same form. What remained was not a blank slate. It was something quieter and more accurate. A man who no longer carried the urgency of definition. That a man allowed to be inconsistent without consequence. That a man who no longer needed to know exactly who he was in order to continue being. This was the final disappearance, not from the world, but from the version of himself that once demanded control. And in that disappearance, for the first time, he felt unburdened by identity. Chapter 9. When time becomes the only authority. Time does something strange when it is no longer measured by urgency. It stretches, not outward, but inward. The hours don't become longer, perception does. Paul felt this shift first in the mornings, when there was no immediate reason to rise quickly. No calls to return. No movements to anticipate. No outcomes to steer. The day no longer waited for him. It simply arrived. And in that arrival, time became the only authority left. There had once been layers of command pressing inward from all sides. Expectation, reputation, consequence, loyalty, survival. Each hour used to arrive already burdened with purpose. Now hours appeared clean, undecorated by obligation. He was no longer stepping into schedules constructed by necessity. He was stepping into empty frameworks and deciding what, if anything, belonged there. At first, the absence of pressure felt like disorientation. The mind, trained for decades to respond to stimulus, searched for friction. It tried to invent urgency. It brought up unfinished narratives. It produced echoes of former responsibilities. But over time, even the mind learned that nothing was required of it. And this was the most unfamiliar command of all, not an instruction to act, but permission to remain. Paul noticed that memory no longer arrived in sequence. It came in fragments, moments detached from outcome. Not the grand arcs, not the conclusions, not the climaxes. Just single scenes, a voice in a room, a glance held too long, a silence that once carried weight but now floated freely. These memories no longer demanded interpretation. They no longer required reconciliation. They simply existed. Time, stripped of agenda, had become neutral. That it did not accuse him, that it did not praise him, that it only moved at some point. Paul realized that without opposition, the sense of self becomes porous. The outlines blur. The distinctions that once felt critical dissolve into gradient. He no longer experienced himself as separate from the passing of days. He moved at the same speed as the light shifting across the room. This alignment with time was not spiritual. It was mechanical. When resistance disappears, motion becomes smooth. In his earlier life, time had felt like a resource, something to be used, defended, exploited. Now it felt like an environment, as natural as air, as unbothered as weather. He stopped trying to get ahead of it. And without that pursuit, the need for control weakened. There is a moment when people realize they are no longer preparing for the future, not because they have given up, but because preparation itself no longer defines meaning. Paul had reached that moment quietly. The tension that once lived in tomorrow was gone. Tomorrow no longer stood as a proving ground. It was simply another space, another permission, another unfolding without demand. He noticed the shift in small ways. He no longer thought in deadlines. He no longer framed time as loss or gain. The internal vocabulary of "before it's too late" had evaporated. Late for what? Nothing remained that could expire in his hands. Time no longer chased him. He no longer chased time. They traveled alongside one another without contest. And in that mutual neutrality, something fragile began to emerge. Not excitement, not dread, but steadiness. A steady that carried no edged, no demand, no fear of interruption. He could sit without justification, move without explanation, stop without guilt. These had once been luxuries. Now they were defaults. The mind resisted this at first, mistaking calm for danger. It searched for threat in quiet, uncertainty in stillness. But there were no alarms following the silence. No consequences arrived. The world did not react to his lack of urgency. The mind released its caution. And in that release, the old architecture of stress softened. Paul began to realize that time is not cruel, that we make it cruel by attaching ourselves to outcomes that require speed. Remove the outcome, and time becomes gentle, not kind, not comforting, just gentle. Unopposed. That he was no longer racing decay, that he was no longer bargaining with delay, that he was simply participating in duration, moment by moment. This participation demanded no approval, no defense, no future justification. He had entered a state where time no longer asked what he intended to do with it. And in return, he stopped asking what time intended to do with him. They met as equals for the first time. Not rivals, not adversaries, not tools of each other, but parallel movements through the same quiet field. And for a man who had once defined himself through dominance over motion, this surrender to mutual rhythm was the deepest transformation of all that it required. Nothing, and offered everything that pressure had once promised but never delivered. Silence began to feel like a companion, not as absence, but as uninterrupted presence, the kind that does not insist on tomorrow, the kind that makes no claim on yesterday. Only this, only now, only movement without story, and in that movement, Paul felt the subtle, undeniable truth that when time becomes the only authority, the self finally stops pretending it is in control. There is a strange moment when urgency gives up without announcing its departure. It doesn't shatter. It doesn't collapse dramatically. It simply fades, like a sound that keeps playing until you realize you stopped hearing it several minutes ago. For Paul, that realization arrived quietly one afternoon when he caught himself staring through a window without any sense of waiting. Nothing was pending. Nothing was at risk. Nothing demanded resolution. And in that absence, the illusion that urgency had once been essential finally dissolved. For most of his life, everything had been framed through pressure. Even rest had been conditional, a pause between movements, never a destination. Stillness was allowed only when it served momentum. Reflection existed only if it sharpened strategy. Even silence had once been a preparation for speech. Nothing stood on its own. But now, with the machinery of obligation dismantled, Paul began to understand that urgency was never LAWD. It had been theater, the story repeated until everyone believed it. Urgency convinces people that everything matters immediately or not at all. It compresses time into a narrow corridor where choice feels restricted and hesitation feels dangerous. Under urgency, decisions feel heavy not because they are important, but because delay is treated like failure. Paul had lived decades under that compression. Now the corridor had widened into something unrecognizable. The collapse did not create relief first, it created disorientation. Without urgency, the future no longer appeared as a line rushing toward him. It appeared as open space, undefined, unhurried, and strangely weightless. This weightlessness was uncomfortable at first. The mind kept reaching for friction, something to push against. But the walls were gone. He noticed it in how he walked. The pace had changed, not slower, necessarily, just unforced. His movements no longer communicated intention to anyone, including himself. They simply occurred. The internal sense of countdown, the perpetual feeling that something must happen before a moment expires, had vanished. There was no clock breathing against the back of his neck anymore. At first, this felt dangerous. Because urgency once felt protective. It felt like awareness. It felt like survival. But over time, it revealed itself as distortion. Paul began to see how much of his past decision-making had been shaped not by clarity, but by pressure masquerading as necessity. Things that once felt inevitable now appeared as choices hurried into place. The longer he lived without urgency, the more he saw it for what it had truly been, a manipulator of perspective. Urgency narrows options. Calm multiplies them. In the absence of urgency, the mind recovers its full field of vision. The world stops appearing as a series of obstacles and deadlines and instead resumes dimensional depth. Time regains length. Thought regains distance. Even emotion regains range. Paul now felt feelings that had once been inaccessible under pressure. Not joy in any dramatic sense, not sorrow either, but a soft neutrality that allowed space between stimulus and reaction. For the first time, he could experience something without instantly categorizing it as useful or dangerous. That alone was a rebellion against his former life. Memory, once filtered through urgency, began to change tone. Instead of replaying only the most critical moments, the crossroads, the confrontations, the turning points, memory began offering ordinary scenes. Mundane conversations, passing comments, rooms without significance, days that never mattered. These uneventful moments had once been invisible. Now they populated his inner world like quiet witnesses to a life he had never truly noticed while living it. Urgency had edited his life down to only its sharpest edges. Without urgency, the full landscape returned. He started to understand that urgency is not the engine of meaning. It is the eraser of it. It strips away anything that doesn't immediately advance an outcome. It compresses lived experience into only what produces consequence. Under its reign, people forget how to inhabit time. They only learn how to process it. Paul had processed time. Now he was inhabiting it. And that distinction reshaped everything. Without urgency, regret changed form. It no longer screamed. It whispered. It no longer chased him for decisions. It settled into awareness without demand. The past existed without insisting on correction. It simply stood as what had been. And the future stopped calling for preparation. It waited without expectation. The illusion that life must always be moving somewhere in order to be real had finally broken. Life was happening regardless of direction. Breath still arrived. Light still shifted. The world continued without consulting outcome. This realization did not bring enlightenment that it brought grounding, that a kind of existential gravity that no longer depended on consequence. Paul began to see how urgency had once performed an emotional trick. It made pressure feel like purpose. It made tension feel like destiny. It transformed constant motion into significance. But motion itself is neutral. It becomes meaningful only when the mind assigns it weight. And Paul's mind was no longer assigning weight out of fear of delay. For the first time, time no longer felt like a fuse burning towards something. It felt like a river that did not care where he stood along its edge. And standing along its edge, without compulsion to enter, without compulsion to resist, became the truest freedom he had ever known. Not freedom to act, but freedom from needing to. Urgency had once driven his identity. Now its collapse revealed something more subtle and far more difficult to confront. Who he was without pressure, without proving, without racing, without becoming, just being. And in that being, stripped of countdowns and consequence, Paul discovered that urgency had never been the source of his power, that it had been the shadow that disguised his fear of stillness. Now that fear was gone, and nothing rushed in to replace it. Only quiet, only duration, only life unfolding without demand for acceleration. There is a quiet moment that comes when a person realizes they are no longer moving toward anything. Not because they are lost, not because they have failed, but because the idea of arrival itself has quietly dissolved. Paul reached that moment without ceremony. There was no announcement in his thoughts, no dramatic realization, just a subtle understanding one morning that nothing ahead of him was being waited for. For most of his life, the future had functioned like a destination, a place where things would finally make sense, where efforts would justify themselves, where pressure would resolve into reward. Goals once stacked on top of each other like stairs, each step promising legitimacy if climbed quickly enough. But now, the stairs were gone. And without stairs, there was nowhere to ascend. This did not feel like defeat. It felt like release from a question that had never stopped asking. What's next? Had ruled his inner world for decades. Even in moments of rest, that question lurked underneath like background noise. But now it had gone quiet. Not answered. Just irrelevant. The absence of forward demand produced an unfamiliar sensation, a kind of weightless stability. He was not suspended in uncertainty. He was grounded without direction. A state that once felt unimaginable now felt strangely natural. Without needing to arrive anywhere, he began to notice how much of past movement had been fueled not by desire, but by avoidance. The future had once functioned as escape, escape from discomfort, escape from consequence, escape from identity. Constant movement forward prevented the present from hardening into something unchangeable. But now the present no longer felt like something to flee. It was firm and quiet, and it held him without resistance. Paul became aware that people spent their lives rehearsing arrival. They imagine the day they will be secure, the moment they will be whole, the version of themselves that will finally be finished. But arrival is a mirage. The future always recedes as it approaches. When people think they are almost there moves further away. That he had participated in that chase. Now he had stepped out of it. And without that chase, the self no longer needed to be continuously edited for the sake of tomorrow. There was no future version of himself to construct, no narrative arc to complete, no transformation required to enter legitimacy. He already existed, and that existence did not require improvement in order to remain valid. This realization rearranged how he experienced regret. Without arrival as a destination, the past stopped appearing as a failure to reach somewhere. It became simply something that had moved through him. Its shape no longer bent around missed potential or unfulfilled arrival. It straightened into record rather than judgment. He did not feel absolved. He felt unburdened by redefinition. When a man no longer needs to arrive anywhere, identity loosens. It no longer tightens around ambition. It no longer folds itself around momentum. It becomes flexible, permeable, almost transparent. Not in the sense of disappearance, but in the sense of no longer insisting on form. Paul noticed this transparency in how he related to his own thoughts. Ideas no longer lined up into projects. They drifted without agenda. He did not need to turn them into plans. He could let them pass like clouds without converting them into storms. He no longer felt the itch to shape the future. He could let it remain formless. The deepest change, however, arrived through desire. Desire had once been organized around acquisition and control, movement towards something not yet possessed. But without destination thinking, desire softened into appreciation. One no longer pulled outward. It stayed present that he could want less, and in wanting less, he needed even less. This economy of inner demand created a rare stillness, the kind not created by suppression, but by sufficiency. Nothing was missing, not in a philosophical way, not as an idea, but in experience. There was no hunger for continuation, only acceptance of persistence. Even time responded differently when arrival disappeared. Days stopped feeling like steps forward. They became individual spaces, complete in themselves. Morning no longer launched anything. Night no longer closed anything. Each segment stood alone without obligation to justify the one before or after it. Life was no longer a sequence of preparation and payoff. It was a collection of moments that did not owe each other explanation. This was the most unfamiliar freedom he had ever known. Not freedom to choose, not freedom to escape, but freedom from the need to become. Paul now sensed how deeply people are bound by the myth of arrival. They believe that once they reach a certain point, financially, socially, emotionally, they will finally be permitted to rest. But rest is not granted by achievement. It is claimed through surrender. And surrender is not something that comes easily to those who have spent their lives in motion. But once it arrives, it does not demand maintenance. It sustains itself through absence of resistance. Paul had finally ceased to resist time, that he had ceased to outrun memory. He had ceased to chase definition. And with that cessation came a presence that asked nothing of him. No arrival, no destination, no becoming. Just being where he was, without treating it as a temporary state. And in that being, for the first time, nothing felt overdue. Nothing felt unfinished because it had failed. Some things simply ended, some things simply passed, and he no longer needed to arrive at a version of himself where any of it made sense, because meaning was no longer attached to progress. It was attached to continuity without demand. This was the state he had entered, not resolution, not redemption, not downfall, but suspension without struggle. A man no longer moving toward anything. A man no longer running from anything. A man no longer required to arrive anywhere at all, only to remain, quietly, where time had already placed him. Chapter 10. Cracks in the Inner Architecture. Even the strongest structures weaken in ways that cannot be seen at first. The failure does not begin with collapse. It begins with tiny shifts, invisible strains, hairline fractures that spread silently beneath the surface. Paul felt these cracks long before he ever understood what they meant. At first, they did not announce themselves as fear or doubt. They arrived as fatigue, a subtle erosion of certainty, a thinning of the inner walls that had once held everything in place. For years, his sense of self had been built like a fortress, layered, reinforced, defended by routine and resolve. Decisions had once come easily because they were shaped by habit. Lines were drawn early and rarely crossed. The architecture of his thoughts was rigid enough to support pressure. But now, without urgency as mortar, those walls no longer felt solid. They stood, but they no longer felt permanent. The first cracks appeared as hesitation, not the kind that stops action, but the kind that questions relevance after the fact. He would make a choice, not because it was needed, but because it was familiar. And afterward, a strange awareness would drift in, that nothing had depended on that choice at all. The machinery of decision-making continued to turn out of muscle memory alone. The structure functioned, but it no longer mattered. This discrepancy between action and consequence unsettled him more than any fear ever had. Fear, at least, once served a purpose. It sharpened. It commanded. This was different. This was emptiness behind motion. The inner architecture had not collapsed. It had simply stopped being necessary. Paul noticed the change in his language. His internal sentences no longer carried verbs of claim. No must, no need, no should. His thoughts softened into observation rather than command. He did not instruct himself anymore. He noted. That shift, subtle as it was, altered the entire structure of awareness. The mind that once issued orders now narrated absence. And in that narration, it discovered how much of life had been built on internal enforcement. Even when no one was watching, He had been watched by expectation, his own. Now that watch had relaxed. The discipline remained. The meaning behind it did not. This created an uneven pressure inside him. A structure designed to hold weight now supporting nothing. The beams did not break immediately. They creaked. They bent. They slowly adjusted to carrying less than they were built for. That adjustment was not peaceful. There were moments when his identity felt hollowed, not lost, not erased, but cavernous. He could feel the echo in his thoughts. Where once there had been friction, now there was drift. This was not depression. It was deconstruction, an undoing of internal necessity. Paul began to realize that much of what people call strength is simply sustained tension. The ability to remain under constant psychological load becomes mistaken for resilience. But when the load is removed, that same tension becomes distortion. Muscles trained only to contract do not know how to release without pain. The cracks widened along these lines that he felt irritation more sharply now, without warning. Not because things mattered more, but because the familiar scaffolding that once absorbed discomfort was thinning. Every small disruption landed directly on awareness. Noise felt louder, silence felt deeper, time felt heavier in its openness. He had once been insulated by constant engagement. Now he was exposed to stillness, and stillness has pressure of its own. There were nights when sleep refused to settle into him easily. Not because of fear of tomorrow, but because the mind, no longer exhausted by pursuit, had wandered. It examined edges that had once been buried beneath momentum. It touched questions he had never needed to answer. Not, what will happen? But why did anything ever need to? These questions did not accuse him. They simply existed, and their existence alone unsettled the old architecture. Paul realized that identity requires continuous reinforcement. It survives through repetition. Remove the need to repeat, and the form begins to blur. The self does not vanish. It loosens. It spreads. It becomes harder to locate. This diffusion frightened him quietly, not because he felt unsafe, but because he felt undefined. The cracks were also emotional. He found himself unexpectedly moved by things that once would not have registered. A passing look between strangers, the slow patience of weather, the quiet rhythms of ordinary people moving through their evenings without spectacle or agenda. These were not sentimental reactions. They were neutral responses to presence. But neutrality, after a life of tension, feels radical. And radical change often begins without chaos. It begins with soft unraveling. The architecture that once supported him had not failed. It had simply outlived its function. And now the cracks were what allowed light to enter, not as revelation, not as redemption, but as exposure. Exposure to the fact that identity, when no longer under pressure, becomes malleable, not rigid, not forceful, not defended by urgency, just human. And recognizing one's own humanity after decades of structure is not comforting at first. It is disorienting. Because humanity does not operate on command. It unfolds. It hesitates. It adjusts slowly. Paul had spent most of his life in command. Now he was learning what it meant to simply exist without issuing orders to himself. And that, more than any external threat, tested the limits of the inner structure he had relied on for so long. The cracks were no longer invisible. They were beginning to change the shape of who he was. There are ideas so old inside a person that they no longer feel like ideas. They feel like gravity. They do not announce themselves as beliefs. They operate as natural laws, invisible, unquestioned, unavoidable. Paul had lived under these unseen laws for so long that he had never known they could be lifted. Until now, the cracks in the structure had not arrived with violence. They arrived with curiosity. Not the loud kind that seeks answers aggressively, but the quiet kind that simply notices when things no longer behave as expected. He began to sense that many of the forces shaping him were not convictions he had chosen. They were inheritances he had never examined. Expectation, hierarchy, control, outcome. These concepts had once shaped his entire internal weather. Not debated, not reflected upon, simply assumed. They had guided decisions without requiring consent. They had structured relationships without asking permission. They had defined success without allowing alternatives. And now, with the pressure of urgency gone, those assumptions felt heavy for the first time. Heavy not with meaning, but with age. Paul discovered that unexamined beliefs do not decay evenly. They remain solid long after they stop being true. They continue to exert influence even when their relevance has vanished. And because they feel fundamental, they resist removal more fiercely than new ideas ever could. The weight of what was never questioned is not felt as burden at first. It is felt as resistance to change. Paul felt this resistance as discomfort when new thought patterns tried to settle. When the mind leaned toward neutrality instead of polarity. When situations refused to fit into old categories. When people no longer arranged themselves into positions of threat or asset as easily as they once had. The internal system hesitated, not because it was confused, but because it was loyal to rules it had never been given the chance to reconsider. That loyalty became tension, and tension revealed the weight. He became aware, slowly, that many of his former reactions had never belonged to the present. They were reflexes inherited from earlier conditions, environments where speed mattered, where trust was dangerous, where hesitation carried cost. Those environments were gone, but the reflexes remained. They continued to shape perception even when the landscape had changed. This was the fourth crack, the mismatch between current reality and inherited response. Paul began to see that identity, when left unexamined, becomes a museum of survival strategies long after the dangers that created them have passed. He was living with habits designed to handle storms that no longer arrived. Yet those habits continued to define his posture toward the world. Tense, guarded, prepared for collision. But collisions were no longer coming. Only quiet. And quiet exposed the unnecessary armored at first. The removal of this weight felt like vulnerability. A terrifying sense of exposure, as though shedding the armor would invite catastrophe. But nothing attacked. Nothing surged forward to exploit the softness. The world remained indifferent. Stable. Predictable. The threat existed only in memory. That realization was destabilizing in a different way. Not dangerous, but disorienting. When a person realizes that their defenses are no longer required, the mind scrambles to justify them anyway. Because to release them is to admit that much of one's life was governed by continued preparation rather than actual necessity. Paul had been prepared, constantly. Now there was nothing left to prepare for. Yet the reflex still twitched. This created internal contradiction. He was no longer needed to be watchful, but he had forgotten how to stop. The weight of what was never questioned pressed hardest in moments of stillness. In those moments, the mind attempted to reconstruct purpose from old blueprints. It searched for causes to defend against. It tried to summon an enemy out of uncertainty, but uncertainty offered no face, only openness. The difference between fear and uncertainty is subtle but profound. Fear has an object. Uncertainty does not. Fear may be confronted. Uncertainty may only be tolerated. Paul was learning to tolerate, and tolerance requires the release of control. Control had once defined him. Now it weakened that he noticed this shift most in how he related to the concept of dominance. The need to shape outcomes, to influence direction, to impose will. These impulses had once lived at the core of his behavior. They had organized his world into hierarchies of power and submission. Now those hierarchies felt arbitrary, not immoral, not evil, just hollow. Why dominate when nothing is being contested? Why command when no direction is required? This emptiness did not make him kinder, that it made him neutral, and neutrality terrified him. Because neutrality offers no feedback, that it neither resists nor rewards, that it simply reflects absence of conflict. The weight of what was never questioned began dissolving at its edges, not in explosive revelation, but through fatigue. The fatigue of maintaining unnecessary structure inside an environment that no longer asked for it. Paul saw now how belief systems persist not because they remain true, but because questioning them requires energy people no longer realize they possess. But now his life had become energy, not intensity, not force, just duration without resistance. And in that duration, questioning no longer felt costly. It felt inevitable, that he questioned the morality he had borrowed, the loyalty he had inherited, the definitions of success that once dominated his thinking, not with bitterness, not with guilt, just with unfamiliar distance. The greatest danger to an unexamined belief system is not attack, that it is calm. Calm gives time to look, and looking gives space for doubt. Paul had never been afforded calm for this long before. Now it surrounded him like an atmosphere that could not be escaped, and inside that atmosphere, the way of what was never questioned began to settle into visibility, not as truth, not as error, but as choice deferred too long to feel optional. That he now realized that many of the walls in his inner architecture had not been built to protect him. They had been built to keep him from seeing how many alternatives he had once ignored. The cracks were no longer just mechanical. They were philosophical, and philosophical fractures do not heal, they transform. When a structure breaks slowly, it does not announce reconstruction. There is no ceremony for what follows collapse in motion. The rebuilding begins quietly, almost invisibly, not as a new fortress rising, but as an improvisation of balance. Paul felt this reassembly before he understood it, not as clarity, not as resolution, but as a subtle shift in how his thoughts returned after wandering. The mind, once rigid, had grown fluid, and fluid things do not rebuild by design. They settle into whatever shape the container allows. Paul discovered this as a quiet change in how he responded to internal fragmentation. Before, the cracks had unsettled him because they disrupted coherence. He had been trained to maintain consistency of self at all costs. Now, inconsistency no longer felt like threat. It felt like information. Contradictions appeared without demanding elimination. Ambivalence no longer required correction. That he could feel two opposing things without forcing one to defeat the other. This was the first sign of a new structure forming. Not one built on certainty, but one built on capacity. Capacity for tension without rupture. Capacity for silence without collapse. Capacity for not knowing without fear. The old architecture had depended on rigid alignment. Every belief, every reaction, every decision pointed in the same psychological direction. That alignment had once created power, but power requires compression, and compression creates brittleness. The new formation was unfolding through dispersion, not power through unity, but resilience through plurality. Paul began to notice that thoughts no longer lined up behind each other like soldiers. They arrived like separate currents, sometimes crossing, sometimes colliding, sometimes dissolving into each other without clear winners. This would have once driven him toward forced resolution. Now he allowed it to remain unsettled. Unsettledness became permissible, and permission is the foundation of a new internal order. This new structure did not operate on dominance. That it operated on accommodation. That change altered the entire emotional ecology inside him. Instead of suppressing discomfort, he began to witness it. Instead of organizing sensation into threat or opportunity, he experienced sensation as sensation, neutral data passing through awareness. Pain did not escalate into crisis. Pleasure did not escalate into pursuit. Everything was held at the same altitude. This leveling was not numbness. It was equilibrium. A state his old structure could never tolerate. The most radical reconstruction occurred in how he understood responsibility. Responsibility had once been anchored to outcome, results, consequences, proof. Action implied accountability. Influence implied obligation. Control implied burden. Now responsibility became something quieter. It became attentiveness, not to what he could shape, but to what he could notice. He was no longer responsible for steering events, only for how fully he remained present inside them. This inversion disoriented him at first. A life once defined by effect, now defined by awareness, felt strangely unsubstantial. But over time, he realized awareness was heavier than influence. Influence only changes surface configurations. Awareness reshapes internal gravity. The rebuilding did not return him to strength as he once defined it. It returned him to permeability. He could be affected without disintegrating. He could be moved without being displaced. He could encounter contradiction without requiring dominance. This new architecture did not create stability through control. It created steadiness through openness. Paul now sensed that the old inner framework had been designed to survive threats. The new one was designed to survive presence, and presence requires far more endurance than threat. Threat activates. Presence sustains. The new structure also altered his relationship with the unknown. Where once uncertainty provoked tension, it now provoked mild curiosity. Not interest in resolution, but interest in continuity. He no longer leaned into the unknown asking what it would become. He leaned into it simply to observe that it was there. This shift dismantled the idea that understanding must precede acceptance, that he began to accept without requiring explanation. This was the final inversion, and it completed the reassembly. The cracks that had once threatened identity had now become the joints of a different kind of coherence. The structure was less imposing, less symmetrical, less fortified, but it was alive. It flexed, it adapted, it yielded without vanishing. Paul recognized now that the strongest structures are not those that never crack. They are the ones that incorporate their fractures into function. What had once been failure points had become points of movement. What had once been weaknesses had become entrances. The inner architecture was no longer a fortress. It was a corridor. Motion passed through it. Experience passed through it. Time passed through it, and nothing was trapped again. This reassembly did not restore who he used to be. It made that question irrelevant. He was no longer rebuilding identity. He was creating permeability between existence and awareness. And in that permeability, life no longer struck against him. It flowed through him. That was the final transformation of the structure, from something that held against the world into something that allowed the world to pass. And in that transition, the idea of collapse lost its meaning entirely, because nothing had truly fallen. It had only opened. Chapter 11. When the past stops asking for permission. There comes a moment when memory no longer waits to be invited. It does not knock. It does not announce itself with emotion or warning. It simply arrives, not as intrusion, but as presence. For Paul, this shift marked another quiet turning point. The past had once obeyed the rules of avoidance. It surfaced only when triggered, only when necessary, only when it could be framed and managed. Now it moved freely, not aggressively, not dramatically, but without asking for permission. He began to notice how memories no longer carried urgency or weight in the same way. They did not crash into him, demanding interpretation. They drifted instead, small images, fragments of voices, brief scenes without context or judgment. A room at dusk. A conversation whose ending he could no longer recall. The sound of footsteps somewhere far away in a time that no longer existed. The past had stopped behaving like evidence. It had become atmosphere. This was unfamiliar and deeply unsettling in its own quiet way. When memories lose their status as proof, they lose their power to define a person. Paul was no longer being shaped by the past. He was simply coexisting with it. This coexistence required a different kind of strength, not the strength to suppress, but the strength to allow. He realized that for most of his life, memory had served as justification. Every decision, every movement, every posture had been anchored in reference to what had already happened. Lessons learned, dangers survived, rules reinforced. The past had functioned like a governing document. Now the document had dissolved into scattered pages, readable, but no longer binding. Paul began to understand that the past only controls the present when the present refuses to stand on its own. When awareness no longer depends on history for permission, memory loses its jurisdiction. It becomes story rather than law. This transformation did not erase the past. It reclassified it. This reclassification altered how he related to his own narrative. There was no longer a central storyline pulling everything into coherence. There were multiple threads, some unresolved, some unfinished, some without conclusion at all. And that multiplicity no longer threatened identity. He did not need a single version of himself to remain intact. The mind had loosened its demand for continuity. And in that loosening, Paul felt something rare: freedom from narrative cohesion. Most people are imprisoned not by events, but by the need to make their life into a story that makes sense. Paul's life no longer needed to make sense in sequence. It only needed to exist in presence. This shattered the hierarchy of significance. Moments that once felt monumental now felt equivalent to moments that once felt irrelevant. A conversation carried the same texture as a turning point. A passing glance held the same emotional temperature as a remembered conflict. Everything flattened, not into meaninglessness, but into equality. That equality was the most radical restructuring yet. Without hierarchy of memory, there was no longer a peak self to return to. No golden era to regain. No version of himself elevated above the others. The man he had been at any point in time now stood beside every other version without dominance. This dismantled nostalgia. Nostalgia depends on contrast. When contrast dissolves, so does longing. Paul did not long for his past. He did not reject it. It simply moved through him like weather across open land. This altered how he experienced regret. Regret no longer sharpened into pain. Without a preferred version of the past, there was nothing to compare the present against. The mind stopped asking, "What should I have been?" because it no longer maintained a standard for the question that he had not failed to become something he had simply become. This realization carried weight, not emotional weight, existential weight, the kind that settles without pressure. The past now flowed without demand for correction. It existed without requesting apology. It did not defend. It did not prosecute. It simply passed through awareness like sound passing through air. Memory had stopped making claims, and in doing so, it had stopped making demands. Paul began to sense how deeply people are bound by their own narratives, how they cling to identity through remembered struggle, remembered victory, remembered loss. Those memories become currencies exchanged to prove continuity, suffering, legitimacy that he no longer needed proof. The present required no justification through history. The greatest shift came not from what he remembered, but from what he no longer felt required to remember. The mind had learned to forget selectively, not by erasing, but by refusing to prioritize. That refusal created space. And in that space, the past no longer asked for permission to exist. It simply existed without authority. Paul had crossed an invisible threshold from living under his history to living alongside it. For most people, identity is stitched together across time. Childhood informs adolescence. Adolescence explains adulthood. Every phase is treated like a chapter that must logically prepare the next. A person becomes a sequence, a before and after, a cause and effect. Paul had lived inside this timeline for so long that he never imagined identity could exist without it. But now, the timeline was unraveling, not breaking. Unraveling that he began to sense that who he was no longer depended on who he had been. The past had stopped acting like scaffolding. The future had stopped acting like destination. What remained was a version of self that existed without narrative obligation, that a self without timeline. This did not arrive as clarity, that it arrived as neutrality. He could remember his past without sliding into explanation. He could imagine the future without attaching himself to outcome. The bridge that once connected memory to expectation had collapsed, and yet he did not fall. He remained standing in the present, unmoored, but stable. This produced an unfamiliar quiet inside him. Not calm in the emotional sense, calm in the structural sense. There was no longer a requirement to maintain continuity with earlier versions of himself. He could contradict who he had once been without feeling fraudulent. He could feel differently now without needing to reconcile it with before. This was not self-betrayal. It was self-released. He saw how people spend their lives defending consistency, how they protect earlier decisions by repeating them, how they preserve identity by refusing to alter direction, how they fear that changing too much will invalidate who they used to be. Paul no longer felt that fear. Validation had detached from continuity. He did not need to remain coherent across decades. He only needed to remain present in minutes. This altered how he experienced responsibility for his own transformation. He was no longer trying to evolve out of the past. No becoming better. No fixing what went wrong. Those frameworks required linear improvement. They required the timeline to remain intact. Paul had stepped outside that structure. He was not correcting himself. He was dissolving the need to correct. Change no longer had to improve anything. It simply had to occur. This realization softened the idea of growth into something less violent. Growth did not need to be upward. It could be lateral. It could be inward. It could even be stilled. He was no longer climbing, that he was adjusting. Identity without a timeline does not chase redemption. It does not fear decline. It does not tremble at the idea of stagnation. It simply relocates its center of gravity into the present moment, where history cannot dominate and the future cannot threaten. Paul felt that relocation physically. The tension that had once lived in his chest now diffused into a quiet spaciousness. There was no pressure to outrun anything, no urgency to surpass anything. Even comparison, once an invisible engine, had lost its momentum. He was no longer in competition with his past. He was no longer in debt to his future. This made him lighter in an existential sense. Not happier, not fulfilled, just unburdened by sequence. The greatest shock was how ordinary this began to feel. The mind adapts quickly to freedom once it stops fearing disorientation. Within this new state, Paul did not feel exceptional for having outgrown his timeline. He felt normal in a way he never had before, not socially normal. Internally ordinary, that he no longer lived as someone emerging from something, that he lived as someone existing within something that simply continued. No backstory required, no climax expected, no arc demanded. This disturbed the instinct to define himself through achievement. Accomplishment depends on chronology. It needs a before that was lacking and an after that proves progress. But without a timeline, achievement loses its interpretive footing. You do not become something. You just appear as what you are in each moment. Paul noticed how this unsettled old impulses. The need to matter, the need to be recognized, the need to leave evidence of existence. These aspirations had once organized his behavior. Now they drifted without anchor, that he no longer needed to leave marks behind, that he no longer needed to justify presence through impact. He could exist without legacy. And the absence of legacy did not feel like annihilation, that it felt like relief from projection. The burden of what he would eventually become had been removed from what he was now allowed to be. He could simply be unfinished without feeling inadequate. This was the quiet revolution of the self, no longer governed by time. Paul understood now. That identity anchored to a timeline is always under pressure. Pressure to progress, pressure to recover, pressure to redeem, pressure to endure. Identity without timeline carries no such demands, that it floats without obligation to direction. Not upward, not forward. Just here. I end this. Now. This was not a conclusion. It was the end of requiring conclusions. When a person no longer frames their life as a process of becoming, something subtle but irreversible occurs. The momentum that once pulled the self forward begins to dissolve. Not abruptly, not dramatically. It dissolves the way tension leaves a body that no longer expects impact. Slowly, quietly, almost imperceptibly. And in that dissolving, a question arises that cannot be answered with ambition. If I am no longer becoming, what remains? For Paul, this question did not arrive with fear. It arrived with stillness. The kind of stillness that does not demand interpretation. The kind that simply exists as an open space where motion used to live. Becoming had once been everything. The lens through which he evaluated worth, progress, failure, and survival. It had given direction to thought and urgency to choice. Now, with becoming gone, the horizon did not collapse. It widened. What remained was not emptiness, that it was presence without projection. He began to notice how little of daily life actually depended on transformation. Morning still came whether or not he was improving. Sounds still traveled, light still shifted, breath still moved through him with automatic patience. The basic mechanics of existence had never cared about his self-concept. They had continued uninterrupted through every version of who he had ever been. This realization created something like humility, but not in the moral sense. It was existential humility, an understanding that life does not require narrative to remain operational. Paul felt this most clearly in moments of complete neutrality, sitting without thinking, walking without planning, listening without preparing response. These moments had once felt like wasted time. Now they felt like the truest experience of time he had ever known. When becoming ends, urgency no longer organizes attention. Attention becomes free, free not to pursue, free to notice. He began to notice existence as texture rather than purpose. The weight of air, the rhythm of distant sound, the simple continuity of motion that did not require an observer to justify it. The world no longer appeared as a field of opportunities or obstacles. It appeared as a field, and he was simply within it. What remained when becoming ended was not identity. It was awareness without agenda. The distinction mattered deeply. Identity seeks reinforcement. Awareness requires none. Identity needs repetition to survive. Awareness is self-sustaining through immediacy alone. Paul began to see how much of his previous life had been spent reinforcing an idea of himself rather than inhabiting himself. Each role had needed maintenance. Each label had needed confirmation. Each version had needed defense. Without those roles now, the maintenance stopped. Nothing needed to be defended anymore. And without defense, there was no longer an adversarial relationship with the world. The collapse of becoming also changed how he experienced continuity. Continuity was no longer something he had to protect through consistency of behavior. It was simply the fact that experience kept occurring. Whether he identified with it or not, awareness continued that he did not need to hold on to who he was. Holding on had been an illusion all along. There was nothing stable enough inside him to require gripping. The self was always changing. The only difference now was that he was no longer trying to stabilize it artificially. This triggered a quiet grief, not for what was lost, but for the effort that had once seemed necessary. Effort that now appeared unnecessary from every angle. The years spent striving toward coherence now looked like years spent avoiding dispersion. But dispersion was not disappearance. It was expansion without shape. Paul discovered that when becoming ends, comparison also weakens. There is no ladder to measure against others, no beginning behind them, no finish ahead. Each person simply occupies the same present without positional superiority. This disarmed judgment, not consciously, structurally. Judgment depends on positioning. Without position, judgment has no foothold. This did not make him compassionate in the traditional sense that it made him uninvested in hierarchy. Hierarchy had once been the grammar of his world. Now it sounded like a language he no longer spoke. What remained was not peace in the cinematic sense that it was equilibrium without narrative. A state where existence did not need to justify itself through progression. Paul had not reached an end. He had stepped out of the concept of arrival entirely. And once arrival becomes irrelevant, nothing feels delayed. Nothing feels premature. Nothing feels overdue. Time loses its edge. The future loses its teeth. The past loses its grip. All that remains is the continuity of happening without the need to frame it inside transformation. This is what remained when becoming ended, a life not moving toward a point of completion. A self not defined by trajectory. A present not under pressure to evolve. Just experience unfolding without a storyline attached to it. Paul had not transcended life. He had simply stopped asking it to be something other than what it was. And in the absence of that demand, life revealed itself without resistance. Not as meaning, not as purpose, but as uninterrupted presence, which, in the end, was all that had ever been there. Chapter 12. When silence becomes a language. Silence had once been something Paul avoided. Not actively, not with fear, but with distraction. He kept motion around himself the way others keep noise in a room, as a buffer, a layer between awareness and what waits beneath it. Silence had always felt like reduction, like subtraction, like something removed that should still be there. Now, silence had changed its meaning. It no longer felt like absence. It felt like presence without interference. It first. This new silence was uncomfortable. Without the constant low hum of internal commentary, the world felt too open. Sound seemed clearer. Space felt larger. Time moved without friction. His own breath became audible in a way that once would have unsettled him. The stillness did not press against him. It rested around him. Paul began to realize that he had lived most of his life inside noise that was not sound, but interpretation. Every moment had once been accompanied by explanation, strategy, revision, anticipation. The mind had constantly narrated experience rather than allowing experience to exist on its own. Now, that narration was slowing, and with it came silence. But this silence was not empty. It was textured. It held nuance. It held depth. It held subtle movement that noise had once hidden. He noticed how silence carried layers. Distant sounds rising and falling unnoticed, faint changes in light, the slow transitions of physical sensation. These were things he had always passed through without acknowledging. Now they lingered, and in lingering, they began to feel communicative. Silence became a language without words. It spoke through continuity rather than statement. It did not argue. It did not explain. It simply revealed reality without filtering. Paul understood then that noise had never been protection. It had been camouflage. It hid the rawness of being inside abstraction. It dulled the edge of presence by constantly redirecting attention toward future or past. Silence did the opposite. It pulled attention inward and outward at the same time. In silence, he could not escape himself through thought. But he also could not become trapped in himself, that he was suspended between inner and outer without boundary. This was unsettling at first. Then it became grounding, that he no longer felt the need to fill space with meaning. He no longer needed to turn every moment into narrative. He could let moments be incomplete without feeling that something was wrong. Silence taught him that incompleteness is not failure. It is a natural state of things. Nothing finishes itself in one moment. Nothing resolves fully while it still exists. Silence allowed this truth to stand without conflict. In that allowance, Paul felt his relationship with time soften even further. When there is no narration, there is no pacing. There are no cues that something should be faster or slower. The moment settles at its own speed. This natural pacing brought an unexpected feeling of trust, not in events, not in outcomes, but in the flow of experience itself. He no longer felt that he had to anticipate what came next in order to survive it. Whatever came next would arrive inside silence. And silence had proven it could hold anything that appeared. That he noticed that even his thoughts had changed sound. They no longer felt loud in his head. They arrived gently and left without resistance. He no longer chased them. He no longer tried to quiet them either. They became part of the same language as silence, not enemies of it, not opposites, complements. Paul realized that silence was not something that happened when sound stopped. It was something that happened when the mind stopped insisting on commentary. That was a far deeper quiet than he had ever experienced before. In that deeper quiet, he felt something he could not name clearly. Not peace, not contentment, not happiness, but a state of non-friction. A state in which nothing inside him pushed against what was happening. And without friction, energy stopped scattering. It gathered without effort. This gathering was not power. It was coherence without rigidity. For the first time, silence did not feel like a void. It felt like a medium, like water, like air, like something that carries rather than subtracts. And Paul began to speak this language without words, through stillness, through patience, through the simple act of not interrupting experience with explanation. Silence was no longer what remained when everything ended. It was what remained when everything unnecessary fell away. For most of his life, Paul had lived in negotiation with himself. Not in words, not in clear arguments, but in constant internal bargaining. What to suppress, what to pursue, what to delay, what to justify. Every decision carried layers beneath it. Even rest had once required permission. Even calm had been conditional. Now, those negotiations were ending, not because he had won, not because he had resolved every conflict, but because the need to negotiate had quietly evaporated. He began to notice this first in moments of choice. There was no longer a council of voices debating what a moment required. He did not weigh consequences with the old intensity. He did not simulate outcomes. He did not rehearse explanations. He acted, or did not act, without internal struggle. This did not make him reckless. It made him direct. The pushing and pulling that once existed between impulse and restraint had softened into a single current. Decisions no longer felt like battles between opposing forces. They felt like natural movements that either arose or did not. And if they did not arise, he let them pass. There was no guilt attached to inaction anymore. No shame in choosing stillness. No fear that doing nothing meant missing something essential. Those fears had once been the fuel of his inner negotiations. Without them, the bargaining had no reason to continue. He noticed the change most clearly when discomfort appeared. Discomfort had once triggered immediate analysis. Why am I feeling this? What does it mean? How do I stop it? Whose fault is it? What should I do about it? The mind would instantly mobilize to manage, contain, or neutralize the sensation. Now, discomfort arrived without provoking this chain reaction. It came, it stayed, it left, and nothing inside him rose up to interrogate it. This was not indifference. It was non-interference, and non-interference altered the emotional climate inside him more deeply than any deliberate effort ever had. Feelings were no longer problems to be solved. They were events that passed through awareness like shifts in temperature. Paul realized that most people are exhausted not by what they feel, but by how much they argue with what they feel. The inner courtroom never closes. Evidence is constantly being submitted. The self is always on trial. Now, there was no trial, no prosecution, no defense. Only sensation moving freely without needing to justify its existence. The same applied to memory. When memories surfaced, he no longer attempted to assign them function. He did not search for lessons. He did not turn them into symbols. He did not use them to reinforce identity. They were simply memories. They existed, and that was enough. The end of inner negotiation also shifted how he related to expectation. Expectations had once been contracts written inside his mind. Promises to become something, to achieve something, to prove something. Failing those contracts once produced anxiety. Pursuing them once produced tension. Now the contracts had dissolved, and with them, the threat of default. Paul no longer felt in arrears to a future version of himself. There was no imagined figure ahead of him waiting to be satisfied. No higher self to report to. No invisible standard measuring his progress. This lifted a pressure so constant he had never realized it could disappear. He could now exist without being evaluated, even by himself. The most profound effect of ending inner negotiation was the disappearance of self-surveillance. For decades, he had watched himself constantly, monitoring tone, posture, reaction, intent. He had lived as both actor and observer of his own life, never fully inhabiting either role. Now, the observer had stepped back, not asleep, absent, and with the observer gone, experience became immediate. He was no longer watching himself live, that he was living. This immediacy removed distance from sensation. He no longer stood outside his own life evaluating its legitimacy. He stood inside it without commentary. Thoughts still occurred, but it no longer hovered above experience like a supervisor. It moved within it like weather. The silence between thoughts had grown wider. And in that wider silence, the need to negotiate disappeared entirely. Paul understood now that negotiation only exists where there is conflict between desire and permission. When desire no longer requires permission, negotiation becomes obsolete. He did not feel free in a triumphant sense that he felt unentangled. There was nothing to resist, nothing to suppress, nothing to justify. Just presence moving forward without needing to be approved. This marked the end of an era inside him. Not the end of struggle in the world, not the end of difficulty, but the end of internal arbitration, that he no longer stood between himself and experience, that he no longer mediated his own existence. For the first time, the distance between awareness and life had closed. And in that closing, all the voices that once negotiated his every step grew quiet, not silenced by force, but released from necessity. For most of his life, time had felt like something adversarial to Paul. It pressed from behind and pulled from ahead at the same time. The past weighed on his back. The future leaned into his chest. The present was squeezed into a thin, fragile strip between regret and anticipation. He had not realized how often he argued with time. He argued with what had already happened, replaying moments, rewriting outcomes, revisiting decisions that no longer existed except as memory. And he argued with what had not yet arrived, planning, rehearsing, predicting harm, predicting success, trying to outrun uncertainty by mapping it in advance. Now, that argument was ending, not with a declaration, not with a resolution, but with exhaustion so complete that the fight itself simply ran out. Time stopped feeling like an opponent because he no longer treated it as one that the past no longer demanded defense. It existed fully, without requiring reinterpretation. It did not need forgiveness. It did not need condemnation. It did not even need understanding. It had already passed its verdict simply by ending. The future, once a looming horizon of conditions and expectations, had softened into an open field of possibilities without obligation. He no longer strategized against it. He did not brace for it. He allowed it to approach without negotiation. And the present, which had once felt like a shrinking corridor between two pressures, expanded quietly into something wide enough to stand within. Paul began to notice that urgency had almost completely dissolved. Not the urgency of genuine necessity, not hunger, not danger, not responsibility, but the artificial urgency created by internal pressure. The constant sense that something must be done immediately, even when nothing truly required movement. That urgency had drained away. Time no longer felt scarce, that it felt available. This did not mean life slowed externally. Clocks still moved. Days still passed. Bodies still aged. Events still unfolded. But internally, The sense of being chased had vanished. He was no longer sprinting away from his own thoughts. He was no longer racing toward an image of completion. He was standing inside duration without needing to compress it. This changed his relationship with waiting. Previously, waiting had been a form of suffering, a pause loaded with impatience, a moment measured against what had not yet arrived. Waiting now felt neutral. It did not imply delay. It did not imply loss. It was simply what existed between now and then. And that was enough. Paul realized that much of human distress comes from the belief that time owes us progress, that every passing moment must justify itself by producing improvement, meaning, or movement toward a goal. Without that production, time feels wasted. And wasted time feels like theft. But now, time owed him nothing. And because nothing was owed, nothing was stolen, that he could sit in a moment without extracting value from it. He could let hours pass without harvesting them for accomplishment. He could breathe without feeling that breath needed to lead somewhere else. This did not make him passive. It made him unburdened. When action arose, it did so cleanly. Not as a reaction to anxiety, not as a defense against meaninglessness, not as an attempt to outrun discomfort. It arose because it arose. And when action did not arise, nothing filled the absence with guilt. This was the quietest peace he had ever known. Not peace as an experience, peace as the absence of opposition. Even his relationship with mortality shifted. Death had once appeared as either a threat or a challenge, something to defeat symbolically by leaving a mark, something to outrun by constructing legacy. Now, death felt like a boundary rather than an enemy. It defined the shape of a life, without demanding that life justify itself. Time no longer felt limited in a way that induced panic. It felt defined in a way that induced clarity. He did not feel the need to outpace it. He simply moved within it. Paul saw now that the self had spent years arguing with time because the self had believed it was separate from time, a thing trapped inside it, struggling against it. Now he sensed that the self was not inside time, but part of its movement. There was no vantage point from which to fight it, only a position within its flow, and in that flow, resistance dissolved naturally. The end of time argument completed the ending of inner negotiation. There was nothing left to contest, nothing left to push against, no invisible opponent pacing him from moment to moment. There was only this unfolding, unclaimed by urgency, unburdened by demand, unmeasured by the old thresholds. And in that unfolding, Paul found something he had never consciously sought, but had always been circling, a life that did not require justification to continue. Chapter 13. The interior stillness after all the noise. After the long argument with time finally ended, something else followed, something Paul did not expect: silence. Not the silence of empty rooms or quiet streets, but an interior stillness that settled deeper than sound. It arrived slowly, like a soft evening tide pulling back years of noise from the edges of his thoughts. At first, the stillness felt unfamiliar, even unsettling. For so long, his mind had been crowded with motion, planning, reacting, remembering, anticipating. The noise had become normal. Without it, there was space. And space demanded attention. In that space, Paul began to notice the smallest sensations again. The way light shifted across a wall, the subtle rhythm of his breathing, the quiet tension that sometimes gathered behind his eyes when a thought tried to form and then gently dissolved before finishing. There was no urgency to complete it, no need to chase it down. For the first time in years, his awareness was not tethered to outcomes. Before, every thought had pulled him forward into consequence. If he imagined something, he immediately leapt to what it meant, what it might cost, what it could become. If he remembered something, he dissected it for lessons, warnings, regrets. His mind had never simply rested. It evaluated, it judged, it forecasted. Now, thoughts passed through like neutral weather, some brief, some heavier, none demanding interpretation. This interior stillness was not created by effort. It was the absence of effort that allowed it to remain. The moment he stopped trying to manage his internal world, that world reorganized itself naturally into something calmer. He realized that the earlier noise had not been produced by events themselves. It had been produced by resistance to events. The arguing, the controlling, the unresolved need to bend life into a shape that matched expectation. With that resistance fading, The mind no longer needed to shout. Paul began to understand that stillness is not the absence of movement. It is the absence of internal friction. The world could move. The body could move. Decisions could happen. But inside, there was no grinding conflict underneath them. This created a strange new relationship with memory. Previously, memory arrived as pressure, images pressing into the present with emotional weight, demanding interpretation or justification. Now, memory appeared as information without command. He could see moments without being pulled into their gravity. There was no closing of the chest, no tightening of the jaw, no covert rehearsal of what should have been said or done. The memory existed, and then it passed. Paul noticed that emotions followed the same pattern. They still arose, but they no longer lingered long after their initial surge. A feeling would move through, crest, and settle. He did not clutch it. He did not fight it. He did not ask it to teach him anything, that he let it be what it was. This changed how he handled discomfort. Discomfort used to feel like something that needed solving. If he felt uneasy, he immediately searched for the source, an unresolved problem, a feared outcome, a misstep in planning. Every emotional signal was treated as evidence of error. Now, discomfort was allowed to exist without explanation. It was no longer treated as proof of failure. It was simply sensation, temporary, shifting, incomplete, and because it was allowed, it rarely stayed for long. Stillness did not make him detached from the world. It made him more precise within it. Without the fog of inner noise, he could sense when something required attention and when it did not. He no longer reacted reflexively. He responded selectively. The absence of chaos made discernment possible. Paul also began to notice something subtle changing in how people related to him. Without the background tension he once carried, his presence became quieter, less defended, less performative. Conversations grew slower, not because words were fewer, but because there was no race behind them, that he was no longer trying to steer interactions toward outcomes. He was meeting moments where they stood. This did not make relationships easier in the dramatic sense. It made them simpler. There was less need to prove, persuade, impress, or shield. What remained was the raw exchange, two presences aligning or not aligning, without internal commentary trying to direct the result. Paul realized that much of his previous identity had been shaped in reaction to noise. The noise of expectation, the noise of reputation, the noise of imagined future judgment. Now that the noise was gone, parts of that identity softened, thinned, or quietly dissolved. He was not losing himself. He was losing the amplification around himself. What remained felt strangely ordinary. And somehow, ordinary felt safe. There was no dramatic breakthrough in this stillness. No revelation thundered into place. It was more like waking up early to a room that had always been quiet while he slept through it. The silence had always existed. He had simply never stayed long enough to notice it. And now, within that silence, something deeper was forming. Not excitement, not ambition, not fear, but steadiness, a steadiness that did not ask for explanation, a steadiness that did not announce itself, a steadiness that simply stayed. As the interior noise faded, Paul noticed something even more unfamiliar beginning to happen. His identity no longer felt rigid. For most of his life, he had carried a strong internal outline of who he believed he was. Not just a name or a history, but a construct built from memory, expectation, reputation, and survival. That identity had once felt necessary, protective, like armor. Now, the armor was loosening, not shattering, not being torn away, simply softening. Paul discovered that identity, when no longer defended, becomes flexible instead of fragile. He could move through moments without measuring himself against past versions. He no longer evaluated his actions against an imagined internal judge. He started noticing that he could act without constantly referencing who he used to be or who he thought he should be. This did not make him empty, it made him available. Available to moments without filtering them through old definitions. Available to change without resistance. Available to stillness without fear of disappearance. There was a quiet relief in realizing that he did not need to maintain a character anymore. Every time he had attempted to preserve identity in the past, tension followed. Now, without that effort, there was room to simply respond no performance, no protection, no rehearsed posture. Just presence. he also began to sense something deeper beneath identity, something that had never been shaped by story. Beneath all the layers of memory and projection, there was an awareness that had always been observing. Quiet, uninvolved, untouched by whatever he believed himself to be at any given moment. This awareness did not need to be improved. It did not grow anxious. It did not age with the body. It simply witnessed. Paul realized that much of his suffering had come from confusing the witness with the story. He had believed himself to be the stream of memory, emotion, and thought instead of the silent observer through which those things passed. Once this distinction became clear, even the most stubborn inner narratives loosened. Thoughts still arose, but he no longer merged with them. Emotions still moved, but he no longer became them. Memories still appeared, but they no longer claimed dominance. They passed through awareness like reflections on water. Clear for a moment, gone the next. This shift subtly changed how fear behaved inside him. Fear had once been a commanding force, tightening his chest, sharpening his attention, pulling him toward imagined futures. Now, fear still arrived at times, but it no longer carried authority. It no longer dictated his reactions. It was allowed to be present without being obeyed. And once fear lost authority, much of its power dissolved on its own. Paul noticed that even regret began to soften. Regret thrives on identity, on the belief that a solid self failed to meet a fixed standard. When identity relaxed, regret no longer had strong footing to stand on. It became less accusatory, less sharp. It transformed into understanding rather than punishment. He began to see that his past, rather than being a verdict, was simply a sequence, one event following another, shaped by conditions, not by a central villain or hero. Each action had emerged from the context available at that time. And now, a new context existed: stillness, awareness, choice without internal pressure. Paul also observed something unexpected. Compassion arose without intention, not just for others, but for himself. There was no push to forgive. Forgiveness simply happened when judgment lost its grip. Self-blame faded not because it was defeated, but because it was no longer required. He began to understand that the mind seeks blame when it believes control was absolute. Once he saw how little control truly shapes the flow of existence, blame lost its logic. Responsibility remained, but condemnation dissolved. In this softened state, life no longer appeared as a battlefield of outcomes. It resembled a continuous unfolding, moment after moment, unedited by expectation. The need to dominate the future lost its urgency. Paul did not become passive. He became uninvolved with inner warfare. This allowed him to meet reality without distortion. Reality no longer needed interpretation. It revealed itself directly. Time also felt different now. Without constant mental projections into past and future, the present expanded. Moments felt fuller, slower, less crowded. Even simple actions, standing, breathing, listening, felt textured with detail. Nothing added, nothing removed. Just experienced. In this quiet, Paul realized that the deepest form of freedom is not the ability to shape circumstance. It is the absence of compulsion to fight what is already here. Freedom from inner resistance, freedom from identity defense, freedom from the false belief that peace must be earned. And as this realization settled into stillness, something inside him aligned, not dramatically, but permanently. A silent alignment, an alignment that did not announce itself, an alignment that simply allowed life to move without friction. As identity softened and the inner conflict faded, something even deeper began to dissolve: Paul's lifelong attachment to meaning. For most of his life, meaning had been something he chased relentlessly. Every moment had to stand for something. Every choice had to justify itself. Every hardship had to prove its value. Meaning had once felt necessary for survival, like a structure that held the weight of existence in place. Now, without the noise of resistance and without the armor of identity, meaning quietly lost its urgency. This didn't feel like emptiness. It felt like space. Paul noticed that when he stopped demanding meaning from each moment, the moment itself became enough. He could sit without asking why. He could move without interpreting the purpose of movement. He could breathe without assigning significance to the breath. Life no longer needed to explain itself in order to be lived. This shift was subtle yet profound. Previously, His mind had functioned like a translator, constantly converting raw experience into story. Now, experience stood on its own. The translation stopped happening automatically. Reality arrived unfiltered, without commentary layered on top. And in this direct encounter with what is, peace emerged naturally. Not as a prize, not as a reward, but as the absence of struggle. Paul realized that much of his former suffering had been driven by the insistence that life must justify itself, that every season must offer a lesson, that every mistake must transform into wisdom, that every loss must redeem itself with growth. Now, none of that was required. Things could simply happen, and then end. This created a strange new relationship with uncertainty. Before, uncertainty had triggered anxiety because it threatened the narrative he believed he needed. Now, without the narrative, uncertainty felt light, open, even gentle. The future no longer needed to be predicted. It could remain unknown without becoming threatening. In the silence after meaning fell away, Paul found something deeper than interpretation. Presence without demand. He began to understand that awareness itself does not seek significance. It does not evaluate. It does not assign value. It simply receives whatever appears and lets it move on. This changed how he experienced both joy and sorrow. Joy no longer needed to be prolonged or protected. It could rise freely and fade naturally without creating fear of loss. Sorrow no longer demanded explanation or justification. It could be felt without questioning its purpose. Both became pure experiences rather than problems to solve. Paul also sensed that when meaning dropped away, comparison lost its grip. There was no longer a scale measuring his life against others, no internal scoreboard tracking success or failure. Without meaning as a framework, comparison had nowhere to attach itself. There was no ladder anymore, just ground. This groundedness did not feel small. It felt vast. And within that vastness, small details felt newly intimate. Sound, light, movement, stillness. Everything arrived unranked. Nothing was more important than anything else. That a breath held the same weight as a lifetime. The mind, once obsessed with constructing purpose, grew quiet out of exhaustion, not of effort, but of relevance. It simply had nothing left to prove. In that quiet, Paul encountered the most radical realization of all. Life does not need to mean anything to be complete. It only needs to be lived, without commentary, without justification, without narrative. The removal of meaning did not remove direction. It removed the illusion that direction must always be understood. Paul could move without knowing why he moved. He could stop without needing a reason. Action became spontaneous rather than strategic. This is where true stillness settled, not the stillness of inactivity, but the stillness of no longer arguing with existence. Paul did not arrive at this place through effort. It arrived when effort was released. He did not achieve it. It revealed itself when striving ended. And this was the quietest freedom of all. Freedom from the need to be free. Freedom from seeking release. Freedom from chasing resolution. Everything he had been searching for had been quietly waiting underneath the search itself. Now, in the absence of meaning, in the absence of identity, in the absence of resistance, life moved without obstruction, and Paul moved with it, not ahead of it, not behind it, with it. Chapter 14. When the past no longer pulls the present. Without meaning to, Paul began to notice that the past no longer arrived with the weight it once carried. It still appeared, but it did not grip. It no longer reached into the present and shaped his reactions before he even realized what was happening. Memory, once a tide that pulled him backward or shoved him forward, now moved like a distant current beneath calm water. There was a time when every quiet moment had filled with echoes. Old conversations replayed themselves with altered endings. Alternate choices unfolded in loops that never reached resolution. The mind had treated the past as unfinished business, constantly calling him back to review what could not be changed. Now, those echoes softened. The memories were still there, but they had lost their urgency. They no longer demanded attention. When they surfaced, they arrived gently, like scenes projected onto fog, already beginning to fade as soon as they formed. Paul realized that the past only holds power when the present is resisted. When the present is fully inhabited, the past has nowhere to attach its claws. This did not mean forgetting. It meant remembering without becoming trapped inside remembrance. Each memory appeared without narrative momentum. There was no continuing inner argument, no effort to justify or condemn. It simply was what it was, something that happened, something that ended. With this shift, time itself began to feel less like a line and more like a field. Events were no longer stacked behind him as a chain of causes. They existed as points in awareness, accessible but no longer dominant. Paul noticed that his body responded differently as well. There was less sudden tightening when certain images arose. No automatic flinch. No reflexive gripping of the jaw. The nervous system no longer prepared for threat rooted in yesterday's warning that it rested. This peaceful relationship with memory created space inside him that he had never known. The mind, freed from the burden of constant historical reference, became lighter. Thinking slowed not out of fatigue, but because it was no longer necessary to maintain vigilance. Paul also became aware of how much of his previous life had been shaped by predictive fear, the attempt to prevent the repetition of past pain. He had planned not just for the future, but against the past. Much of his behavior had been directed toward avoiding echoes. Now, with the echoes softened, that entire structure fell away that he no longer avoided situations because of what once happened. He no longer protected himself from outcomes that only existed as memory projections. The present was no longer required to pay debts to the past. This did not make him reckless, it made him unburdened. Without the constant comparison to what had been, every moment felt newly original. Nothing was predetermined. Nothing was rehearsed. Each interaction arrived as if for the first time. Paul felt less like a character continuing a story and more like awareness moving through fresh experience. Even regret, once a frequent visitor, now lacked an entry point. Regret requires a comparison between what is and what should have been. When should have been dissolves, regret finds no surface on which to stand. Instead of regret, there was clarity. Not clarity about how things ought to have gone, but clarity about how little control had ever truly existed. With this clarity came a softer understanding of causality. Life no longer unfolded as a sequence of personal triumphs and failures. It unfolded as a web of conditions, some visible, most unseen, interacting in endlessly complex ways. This recognition lifted a burden Paul didn't know he was still carrying, the burden of personal authorship. He had once believed he was crafting every chapter of his life through force of will. Now he saw that life had always been a collaboration between intention and circumstance had always been the greater partner. This realization did not diminish him. It freed him from excessive self-importance. It freed him from unnecessary guilt. It freed him from the illusion that he had to carry the entire weight of existence alone as the present grew unanchored from the past. Paul noticed that anticipation of the future softened as well. Fear, hope, and expectation became lighter. He no longer reached forward in constant rehearsal. The future could remain unformed without causing unease. This suspended state, no longer pushed by memory, no longer pulled by projection, became his natural center. Here, between what has been and what might be, the present expanded that it expanded without effort, it expanded without announcement that it simply opened. And within that opening, Paul encountered a stillness deeper than any he had known before. Not the stillness of quiet thought, but the stillness of time no longer tightening around him. As the past loosened its grip and the future softened its pull, Paul became aware of something subtle yet powerful slipping away from him: control. Not the practical kind that guides hands or schedules movement, but the deeper psychological control he had once relied on to feel safe inside the world. The kind of control that whispers, "If I manage this well enough, nothing will go wrong." For most of his life, control had been his quiet companion. He had controlled outcomes, impressions, timing, words, even silence. He had believed that with enough attention, enough calculation, enough effort, uncertainty could be minimized. Control had once felt like protection, like a shield against chaos. Now, that shield was lowering, and what surprised him most was that nothing collapsed when it did at first. The absence of control felt unsettling. There was a faint inner reflex to reassert authority over events, an instinctive tightening when things did not align with expectation. But as he watched that reflex arise without acting on it, it weakened. Each time he allowed situations to unfold without intervention, nothing catastrophic followed. Life continued. Not perfectly, not predictably, but steadily. Paul realized that control had never truly prevented uncertainty. It had only created the illusion that he was standing between himself and randomness. Now, without that illusion, he stood directly inside the flow of events and discovered that the flow was not hostile. Uncontrollable did not mean dangerous. Unmanaged did not mean harmful. That it simply meant unknown. And unknown, when not resisted, felt strangely gentle. That as control fell away, he became more sensitive to the intelligence already moving within life itself. Patterns emerged without planning. Solutions formed without forcing. Encounters aligned without orchestration. He began to see that much of what he believed he had been managing itself all along. This realization brought a quiet humility. He was no longer the conductor, he was part of the orchestra. Within this surrender, Paul felt a new kind of strength take shape. Not the rigid strength of dominance, but the flexible strength of responsiveness. He could now bend instead of bracing, adjust instead of insisting, release instead of resist. Where control once clenched, trust now loosened. Trust not in specific outcomes, but trust in movement itself. Paul noticed that when he stopped trying to steer every situation toward safety, safety arose in unexpected ways. Not through certainty, but through adaptability. Not through prediction, but through presence. Even when discomfort appeared, it no longer felt like a failure of management. It was simply another texture of experience moving through awareness. He no longer treated difficulty as evidence that he must do something differently. Sometimes, the only action required was allowing. Control had once been the framework through which responsibility operated. Now, responsibility remained, but without tension. He could still act with care without gripping the need for guarantee. He could still choose without demanding certainty. This softened form of responsibility felt lighter and more accurate. It was no longer driven by fear of consequence. It was guided by clarity of the moment. In this space, mistakes lost their dramatic weight. Without control as the standard, there was no perfect path to measure against. Every action became part of a living adjustment rather than a verdict on identity. Paul saw that when control dominated, life felt like a maze in which he must master every turn. Now, life felt more like an open landscape, dynamic, shifting, but navigable without strain. Even loss felt different when not framed as a failure of control. Loss became movement rather than damage, an ending rather than a collapse. This did not remove sadness, but it removed the added suffering of blame. Paul no longer asked, "What did I do wrong?" He asked, "What is happening now?" And that question, free of accusation, opened space for intelligence to move naturally through him. He also noticed how this surrender altered his relationship with others. Without the need to manage impressions or control outcomes, interactions grew more authentic. He no longer felt responsible for how others experienced him. He showed up as he was, without reinforcement. This allowed others to do the same. Conversations slowed. Defensiveness weakened. Pauses lengthened without discomfort. Silence became companionable rather than threatening. Control had once shaped every exchange. Now, presence shaped them. Paul realized that control had been rooted in the belief that life must be shaped into safety. Now, he saw that safety does not arise from manipulation. It arises from alignment. Alignment with the moment. Alignment with movement. Alignment with what simply is. The need to control dissolved. Something else took its place. Not looseness, not passivity, but coherence. Actions and awareness began to synchronize. He moved when movement was natural. He rested when rest arrived. There was no forcing of rhythm, only participation in it. And within that participation, Paul felt a quiet stability more reliable than any plan he had ever constructed. Not stability built on certainty, but on adaptability. Not anchored to outcome, but rooted in awareness. This, he realized, was what remained when control fell away. Trust in movement, clarity without tension, responsibility without fear, and freedom without rebellion. As control loosened and surrender became natural, Paul sensed that only one illusion remained, subtle, deeply rooted, and quietly persistent. It was not the illusion of power, identity, or meaning. Those had already softened. What remained was the illusion of separation. For most of his life, Paul had experienced the world as something outside of himself. There was him on one side, and everything else on the other. Even in stillness, even in awareness, there had always been a faint sense of division, an observer standing apart from what was observed. Now, that boundary began to blur. It happened quietly, without drama. There was no moment of revelation, no sudden expansion of understanding. Instead, the sense of being a separate witness simply weakened. Awareness no longer felt like it was watching life from a distance. It felt like it was inside life, moving as it. Paul noticed this first in ordinary moments. Walking no longer felt like a body moving through space. It felt like movement happening within a single field. Listening no longer felt like receiving sound. It felt like sound and hearing occurring together, without distance between them. Even thought seemed less like something he was generating and more like something appearing spontaneously within awareness. There was no longer a strong center saying, "This is happening to me." There was simply, "This is happening." And in that subtle shift, the final layer of tension dissolved. Separation had once been the foundation of fear. Fear requires distance, an imagined space between what is and what might harm. When separation softened, fear found less to cling to. There was no longer a strong sense of being exposed to life. Instead, Paul felt embedded within it, not protected from it. Part of it, this did not make him careless. It made him intimate with existence. Every sound, every movement, every change felt less like an external force and more like a shared motion. Even uncertainty lost its edge. There was no longer a him waiting for the future to arrive. The future was simply movement continuing. Paul began to understand that separation had never truly existed. It had only been assumed. It had been constructed through language, memory, and self-reference. Once attention stopped reinforcing the boundary thinned on its own, and in its place arose connection without effort, connection to the rhythm of time, connection to the flow of events, connection to the quiet intelligence behind motion. This did not create bliss. It created simplicity. There was no longer a struggle to be at peace. Peace was the absence of anything needing to be conquered. Even the idea of self became lighter. Paul could still refer to himself when useful. Names, roles, history remained functional, but they no longer felt like fixed structures. They felt like tools rather than truths. The emotional weight he once attached to my story faded. The story still existed, but he was no longer confined inside it, that he could enter it, that he could leave it. And most of the time, he simply remained outside of it, within the immediate flow of experience. This created a profound gentleness in how he related to everything. There was no longer an urge to grasp moments and turn them into possessions. Experiences passed through without being claimed. Even pain, when it appeared, did not become personal. It was felt, not owned. It moved through and moved on. Paul realized that the deepest suffering had never come from pain itself. It had come from the belief that pain was happening to someone separate. When that belief softened, pain no longer escalated into psychological torment. That it became sensation, not story. With separation dissolving, comparison also vanished at its root. There was no longer a central figure measuring itself against others. There were simply different expressions moving through the same field of life, no hierarchy, no competition, no rivalry. Just variation. This understanding did not make Paul indifferent to others. It made him quietly aligned with them. Compassion arose not as an emotional response, but as recognition. Others were no longer seen as forces outside himself. They were motion within the same continuity. And so, in the end, the last illusion to dissolve was not about control or fear or identity. It was the illusion that he had ever been standing apart from what had always been carrying him. There was never a wall. There was never a division. There had only been attention waking up to the space it already occupied. And in that awakening, the long sense of exile ended. Not with fireworks, not with celebration, but with a quiet return to what had never been left. Chapter 15, Part 1: The Quiet Completion. Completion did not arrive with certainty. It arrived as a soft understanding that there was nothing left to resolve. For most of his life, Paul had lived with the feeling that something invisible was always unfinished. A subtle tension lived beneath every achievement, every rest, every pause. Even in moments that should have felt complete, there was always the sense that something more was needed. One final answer, one final correction, one final victory over uncertainty. Now, that sense was gone. Not replaced, not solved, simply absent. And the absence felt natural. Paul noticed that time no longer felt like a corridor leading somewhere. The future was no longer an arrival point. The past was no longer a place he walked away from. Everything felt suspended in a calm, ongoing present that did not request progress. This did not make life static. It made life sufficient without momentum. Completion did not mean that events stopped happening. It meant that no event was required to finalize anything. Nothing was waiting to be concluded inside him. No chapter demanded a final sentence. The story no longer needed an ending. He began to see that every version of finish line he had chased had only led to another beginning that demanded more effort. Goals had once stacked endlessly, each one promising closure that never quite delivered it. The promise of "once this is done, then I'll rest" had guided years of movement. Now, rest arrived without negotiation, without prerequisite, without explanation. Paul felt a steady peace that did not shift with circumstance. His peace was no longer dependent on what was happening or not happening. Movement could occur. Stillness could occur. Both passed through the same unchanging calm. The mind, once restless for outcomes, now seemed content to witness without seeking advantage. In this completion, nothing felt dramatic. There was no feeling of "now I have arrived." There was simply the sense that there had never been anywhere else to go. Even the idea of spiritual progress softened. Growth was no longer measured. Awareness was no longer evaluated. He was not becoming more. He was no longer moving toward a version of himself that needed to be achieved. He was simply here. That was enough. Paul noticed that his sense of urgency had disappeared. The world could move quickly without pulling him into its speed. News, conflict, ambition, collapse. Everything could pass through his awareness without gripping it. He did not turn away from life. Life simply no longer shook him from his center. He also noticed the disappearance of internal bargaining. There were no silent negotiations with reality anymore. No subtle trades of effort for peace. No quiet demands that life provides certain conditions in exchange for acceptance. Acceptance came first now. Condition-free. This acceptance did not weaken him. It strengthened his relationship with reality. Without resistance, he saw clearly. Without fear of discomfort, he faced complexity directly. Without identity defense, he responded honestly. Completion did not make him passive. It made him unentangled. Paul realized that he was no longer trying to leave a mark on the world. Not because he had given up, but because the need to leave one had vanished. The idea of legacy had quietly lost its charge. Not because legacy was wrong, but because it was no longer necessary. He understood that nothing needs to be remembered in order to be real. Presence did not require permanence. Significance did not require history. Life did not need to echo in order to matter. In this quiet completion, even gratitude transformed. Gratitude no longer felt like a response to fortune. It felt like a natural state of recognition, recognizing that nothing was missing. There was no bonus for being here. Being here was already complete. Paul also noticed how gently his attention now moved through the world. He no longer scanned for threat. He no longer hunted for validation. He no longer avoided uncertainty. His awareness flowed softly from one perception to another without hierarchy. Light through a window. A distant sound. The rhythm of breath. The passing of thought. All equally sufficient. In this completion, there was no finale. No drumroll. No emotional crescendo. Completion was not a moment. It was a condition. A condition of not needing anything to change in order for peace to remain intact. And in this condition, life continued endlessly, without burden, without reward, without resolution, just movement unfolding within an unshakable stillness. For a long time, Paul believed that life was a journey with a destination hidden somewhere in the distance. Every effort, every plan, every sacrifice was shaped by the quiet belief that one day, something final would be reached. A place where striving would stop. A moment where effort would no longer be required. A point where everything would finally make sense. Now, that idea no longer held him. He had not arrived anywhere. He had simply stopped needing to arrive. This changed the quality of every movement he made. Actions still happened, but they were no longer driven by the hunger for future reward. He acted because action was natural. He rested because rest appeared. He spoke because speech arose. Nothing was done to secure a later version of peace. Peace was already here. Living without the need to arrive created a kind of quiet courage. Without chasing outcomes, fear lost the power to bargain. There was nothing to protect for tomorrow, nothing to preserve for later. Each moment stood complete within itself. Paul noticed that when the pressure of becoming dropped away, life grew more generous in unexpected ways. He laughed more easily. He listened more fully. He moved through difficulty with less internal resistance. Even confusion felt lighter because it no longer threatened a future narrative that had to remain intact. Uncertainty became an ally instead of a danger. He also noticed that relationships transformed quietly. Without the need to arrive somewhere together, he could meet people where they were without urgency. He no longer tried to pull conversations toward meaning or resolution. Silence was allowed. Misunderstanding was allowed. Distance was allowed. Nothing needed to be fixed in order to be valid. This removed the quiet exhaustion he had once carried in connection with others. He no longer felt responsible for steering anyone's path. He could witness without directing. And in being witnessed without pressure, others softened too. Paul began to understand that striving had once given him direction, but it had also kept him separate from the very life he was trying to secure. Always aiming ahead had made him miss the depth of what was already present. Now, with arrival removed from the equation, depth returned to ordinary experience. A cup of water was just water. A voice was just sound. A moment was just itself. And yet, everything felt vivid, not because it meant more, but because nothing needed to mean anything. This way of living did not reject ambition. It simply freed ambition from being a condition for peace. If he reached something, it was fine. If he didn't, it was also fine. Neither outcome carried existential weight. Success and failure became symmetrical. Both arrived, both passed, neither defined. Paul began to see that much of the world was locked in perpetual preparation, always moving towards some imagined later where life would finally begin. He saw it in urgency, in anxiety, in constant forward motion, and he recognized his former self within that motion. But now, the preparation was over, not because the future was secured, but because the present was no longer postponed. Living without needing to arrive allowed him to experience time without debt. He no longer borrowed satisfaction from tomorrow. He no longer postponed peace for later. Everything he once delayed now existed openly within the present. Even rest felt different. Rest was no longer collapse after effort. It was a continuous background state that did not depend on exhaustion. Paul also noticed that his thoughts had lost their authority. Thoughts still appeared. Plans still formed. Ideas still moved. But none of them carried the weight of ultimate relevance. They were tools, not truths. The world could continue endlessly in motion, and he could move within it without being pulled apart by expectation. This was not withdrawal from life. It was intimacy with life without demand. Living without needing to arrive did not make him feel unfinished. It made him feel complete without narrative. He no longer viewed existence as a project. He viewed it as a presence that did not aim, a presence that did not accumulate, a presence that simply existed. And within that existence, movement continued naturally, unforced, unguarded. When the sense of arrival disappeared and the pressure of becoming dissolved, Paul discovered the final truth waiting underneath everything he had ever pursued. There was nothing left to seek, not because he had found every answer, not because the world had resolved itself, but because the seeker had quietly fallen away. For most of his life, seeking had felt natural. He sought security. He sought recognition. He sought certainty. He sought meaning. Even when he believed he was resting, part of him remained in motion, scanning, measuring, preparing for whatever came next. Now, that motion had stopped, not through discipline, not through will, but through exhaustion of illusion. He saw clearly that every act of seeking had assumed that something essential was missing. That peace existed elsewhere. That fulfillment lived beyond the present moment. That completion waited somewhere ahead. And now, with the collapse of that assumption, the engine of seeking shut down on its own. Nothing needed to be added. Nothing needed to be removed. Nothing needed to be repaired. Paul experienced the world without the background tension of pursuit. Days unfolded without the pressure to extract meaning from them. Nights passed without the need to interpret what the next morning must bring. Life no longer required explanation. It required only participation. Even curiosity transformed. Curiosity was no longer driven by lack. It was no longer urgent. It became gentle, an openness to what appears, not a hunger for what is absent. Paul could remain in stillness without feeling that he was missing opportunity. He could engage with action without feeling that he was fleeing stillness. Both belonged to the same field now. This ended the internal conflict between movement and rest. He no longer felt torn between doing and being. Each action arose from being. Each pause existed without effort. Nothing competed with anything else. Paul also noticed that the fear of death had softened into quiet acceptance, not as a belief system, but as the natural consequence of no longer clinging to identity. When the idea of a separate self weakened, the idea of personal annihilation lost much of its terror. There was no dramatic confrontation with mortality, only a gentle understanding that appearing and disappearing were movements within the same whole. Even the concept of his life grew thin. Life was no longer something he possessed. It was something happening through him. He was not its owner, that he was its expression. This removed the burden of preservation. He no longer fought to secure permanence within impermanence. He no longer demanded that moments freeze long enough to matter. Moments mattered because they moved, not because they stayed to in this realization. Even the idea of enlightenment lost its grip. There was nothing to achieve, nothing to consolidate, nothing to claim as final understanding. Every attempt to frame this state collapsed into simplicity, and simplicity refused all titles. Paul's attention settled into a quiet, unmoving center. Not a place, not a concept, not an identity. Just awareness without reference. From that center, the world moved freely. That he no longer chased clarity. Clarity occurred naturally when resistance ended. Even confusion could exist without becoming a problem. Nothing needed to resolve into certainty. Life could remain open, and in remaining open, it was complete. There was no final revelation waiting beyond this moment, and no hidden truth postponed for later, and no ultimate realization withheld. Everything that could be known was already here, in the sound that passed, in the breath that moved, in the awareness that noticed both. Nothing left to seek, nothing left to defend, nothing left to become, and with that, the long search ended, not with an answer, but with silence. A silence so complete it did not feel empty. A silence so full it needed no description. This was not the end of a story. It was the end of needing one. As the story fades into silence, what remains is not the noise of what was told, but the stillness of what was felt. Tonight, you walked through shadows and light, through questions with no easy answers, through the quiet spaces where truth doesn't shout. It lingers. Some stories don't end with resolution. They end with reflection, with the soft understanding that darkness often hides in ordinary places. And that awareness is the only light we truly carry. If this story stayed with you, let it rest. Now that there's nothing more you need to solve tonight, and no conclusions to chase, just the quiet of the moment. Before you drift off, take a second to subscribe to True Crime Records, so you'll always have a new story waiting for you when the world grows quiet again. A new mystery, a new voice, a new night. Until next time, sleep peacefully.